Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn. This is our Murders at KARLOV Manor set review, and we finally made it to the end of the line, the big daddy of them all. This is multicolor. So we've already done each individual color in its own video, as well as colorless in a separate video. I'm going to link those down below so you can check those out if you haven't already. This is the final set review video, the multicolor video. There's twice as many multicolor cards as any one individual color, so this is going to be a long one. Strap in, get your coffee ready. I know mine is. And let's do this thing. First up here we have 𝐒𝐂𝐈𝐴𝐻, Spirit of Justice, 1 white, 1 red, and 2 for a 2/4 legendary spirit detective with double strike and vigilance. Whenever 𝐒𝐂𝐈𝐴𝐻, Spirit of Justice, enters the battlefield or attacks, you get to choose up to 1 target creature. If it's suspected, you exile it. Otherwise, you suspect it. I think this guy's a little bit better than he looks on the surface. You got to remember that because of that double strike, he's effectively like a 4/4 vigilance for 4, you know, on the floor, which is fine. But then that double strike makes him a little bit better, because if you run into like a 4/2, 5/2, 6/2, you don't trade with it like you normally would with a 4/4 vigilance creature. So kind of think of it as a 4/4 vigilance with upside. It starts to look a little bit better as your 4-drop. The fact that his ability triggers on entering the battlefield as well as attacking is also really good. You can give something that you already have on the board menace right away, make it hard for your opponent to block it, or just make one of their creatures unable to block. So having that versatility of being able to suspect your creature or their creature is kind of cool. And then being able to trigger that every single time you attack is pretty cool too. As soon as he comes down, you can give one of their guys suspected and they can't block. And then when he swings, you can make another creature unblockable. So now like their best 2 creatures can't block 𝐒𝐂𝐈𝐴𝐻. So it mitigates the problem that you sometimes have with cards like this, where they, you know, generate an ability on attack because your opponent can just block them and kill them even if they have to trade with them. But by the time this thing attacks, it has the opportunity to shut down 2 of your opponent's blockers. And that's pretty powerful. And that's not even counting the fact that, like, if something's already suspected and you just need it gone, like a Sheoldred or whatever, then you just straight up exile it. So there's a lot of versatility there. And I think this guy's actually better in practice than he looks on paper. We're going to have to wait and see when the set launches, but I think he's pretty wild. Obviously first pickable in any kind of limited format. You slam him and you make it happen. Next up, we've got Aquis Proft, Master Sleuth. 1 blue, 1 white, and 1 for a 3/3 legendary human detective with vigilance. When he enters the battlefield, you investigate. And he's got a Sphinx's Revelation tacked on, so you can just pay 2 blue, 1 white, and X, tap him, sacrifice any clue, and then you draw X cards and gain X life. So each of your clues becomes like a super clue in the late game, which is kind of wild. Now, normally, this is too expensive of an ability. I would say it's a little too cute. The chances that you make it late enough in the game to actually use this for, you know, a benefit that you actually want is pretty slim. But because just the body by itself is pretty good, and you can view that tap ability as just kind of gravy, as extra, I actually think that makes this card a lot more playable and a lot better than it looks on the surface. 3/3 vigilance for 3 is fine. Gives you a clue token right away, so it's card advantage right out of the gate. And even if you swing with it because of the vigilance, you can still use the ability, right? So you can swing with it, and then on their turn you can block with it, and then at the end of their turn you can sack a clue to just draw a bunch of cards and gain life, and you can just do that every turn. So I think if you can make it into the late game, if you're a deck that's looking to make it into the late game and you also have some clue support, this guy's going to be kind of a beast, specifically because he's fine on rate, on curve, without the Sphinx's Revelation ability ever really mattering, and that just being gravy. And that's just like the most delicious gravy you'll ever see. So I think that makes this card really good. Next up, we've got Ansrag the Quake Mole, 1 green, 1 red, and 2 for an 8/4 legendary mole god. Wow. Whenever he becomes blocked, you untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase, and you can pay 2 green, 2 red, and 3 to make it so Anzrag must be blocked each combat this turn if able. This is a lot to take in. So first of all, there's the obvious use of, you just have an 8 power creature on turn 4 that has to be blocked, right? Sorry, doesn't have to be blocked, has to be unblocked, or else you get another combat step. So it's really hard. If they block this guy, you get an extra attack, and if they don't block this guy, then they take 8 damage. So either way, they're kind of screwed. The one upside in your opponent's case is the fact that this only has 4 toughness. So they can just block with something that's going to kill it, trade with it, and then you don't have to worry about this thing just going off the rails. But what's interesting is that ability, the 7 mana ability that makes it so it must be blocked each combat this turn if able, that lasts for the entire turn for every combat, not just during the first time you swing with it or the second time you swing with it. So theoretically, what you can do with Anzrag here is you can give him indestructible some way, maybe just an instant speed spell or whatever. But if you have enough mana to give him indestructible and activate this 7 mana ability, what it really amounts to is he swings in, they have to block. It doesn't die. You untap everything. Swing in, they have to block. It doesn't die. You untap everything. You end up wiping their entire side of the board. At the very best case scenario for your opponent, you keep attacking until they're out of blockers, which means you wipe their whole side of the board, and then at that point you also get in for at least 8 plus potentially more damage if you had other creatures still swinging in. So that's insane. Like, that's really, really good. It's kind of like a one-sided board wipe if used correctly, but the fact that you don't have to wait until you have 7 plus mana to do the thing in order for this to just be a good card, like, you can just play it in an aggressive deck and just do stuff with it, you know, just swing in as a powerful creature, maybe get an extra combat phase here or there. But if you happen to get late enough into the game where you have the mana and now you can do the thing, you can just absolutely just decimate your opponent. And I think that's pretty interesting. It's also worth noting it's a pretty nice fling target at only 4 mana for 8 powers, so keep that in mind. Next up, we've got Assassin's Trophy. This is a reprint, 1 green and 1 black for an instant. Destroys any permanent that an opponent controls, and its controller may search their library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield and then shuffle. 2 mana instant speed removal that can hit anything is always going to be good. But I will say this, I don't think this card is as good as it used to be in other standard formats in the past where this card was in the card pool. Just because the power level of standard right now is so crazy, and giving your opponent an extra land to ramp into the next big threat is a lot more powerful, a lot more detrimental, I guess, to you, the player that plays the Assassin's Trophy, than I think it was in the past. Like, it's still going to be a great card. People are still going to use it for sure, but I don't think it's as good as it used to be, and I think you should probably keep that in mind. Next up, we've got Aurelia the Law Above. 1 white, 1 red, and 3 for a 4/4 legendary angel with flying, vigilance, and haste. Whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card. And whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, Aurelia the Law Above deals 3 damage to each of your opponents, and you gain 3 life. So the elephant in the room here is this is going to be best in a multiplayer game like Commander. Obviously, you can get these draw card triggers or lightning helix your opponent's head triggers for each of your opponents, theoretically, which is really, really nice. But even just looking at this card for, like, standard constructed, it's kind of insane, and I think it's actually way better than anyone's giving it credit for. Everyone's looking at this as a 5-drop and saying, like, the 2 abilities are never going to trigger. You're spending 5 mana for something that's just going to be killed with removal. Like, it's just not going to be good enough. But when you really add up all of the little things it does, I don't think that's the case. Like, at the very least, you're slamming this, you're swinging in with vigilance on the turn you play it and getting in for 4, right? And they can't Wandering Emperor it because of the vigilance. And then it's still sitting there as a blocker, so they have to remove it or else they can't really crack back. Like, that in and of itself is not bad. But the fact that it counts itself when you're attacking. Like, whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, draw a card, it counts the Aurelia. So, since it has haste, the turn it comes into play, you only need 2 other attackers along with the Aurelia to draw a card. And if you can just do that, like at that point, if your opponent kills this, but you got in for 4 and drew a card and got rid of a removal spell of theirs, like, that's pretty decent. But then, if you happen to have 4 creatures on the field in addition to slamming the Aurelia, you get to also Lightning Helix them, which is crazy. But the most important part of this card is the fact that it triggers when your opponents attack you as well. So if they don't have removal on their turn, and they're playing an aggressive deck that's gone wide with creatures, you get to draw another card. You get to Lightning Helix their head again. Like, I feel like against aggro, this just absolutely rips them apart. Like, gaining life from the attacking with 5 thing is nuts. It just kind of counters a mono red deck. And granted, 5 mana is a lot, and like, are you still alive by the time you have 5 mana if you're against a mono red deck? But you gotta remember, this is an Angel in a format with Giada. So you could go Angel Tribal, and this can very easily come down on turn 4 instead of turn 5. And not only that, but it can be a lot bigger. So, I don't know. I think this card is really good. I think it's a lot better than people are expecting it to be. I think it will work a lot better in practice than it looks on paper, because I think people are looking at those numbers of 3 creatures and 5 creatures and not thinking of the fact that Aurelia can count as one of them, and you really should be thinking of it at like 2 creatures and 4 creatures, which is way more manageable. So I'm going to absolutely try and brew with this. I'm super excited to try this in Angel Tribal and maybe a couple other brews as well. I think it's awesome. Next up, we've got Blood Spatter Analysis. 1 red and black. 1 red and 1 black for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls, and then it just sits there on the battlefield, and whenever 1 or more creatures die, you mill a card, and then put a Bloodstain counter on Blood Spatter Analysis. Then, you sacrifice it if it has 5 or more Bloodstain counters on it, and when you do, you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is a lot to take in. I need some coffee. So, the general consensus online seems to be that this card isn't very good, and I don't understand. I'm not seeing it. I think surface level, it's too easy to compare this to another piece of removal that costs a total of 2 mana. That's just unconditionally going to be able to kill something rather than just do 3 damage. Or compare this to like a lightning strike where, well, you can do the damage to the head if they don't have a creature. And like, those are relevant arguments, but at the same time, I think they're missing the point of what is going to make this card so good. And that's like, if you're playing turn 2 removal, almost anything that you're going to have as a target is going to still die to the 3 damage from Blood Spatter Analysis. So I don't think you should look at it as like, oh, I have my Blood Spatter Analysis in my hand turn 5 or 6 or whatever, and I need to kill their big threat and I can't. I don't think that's the function that it serves. I think you need to look at this as a cut down in a way with upside, where this just comes down on 2. It clears out their 2-drop or maybe even their 3-drop, but then it gives you this extra value where once it gets to 5 Bloodstain counters, you just sacrifice it and get a free creature back from your graveyard. And if you really do the math about like how likely you are to get this to trigger and what turn you're likely to get to 5 Bloodstain counters, it's kind of at the perfect time to maybe like get back like a Sheoldred that went to the graveyard. Getting something like a Sheoldred back and being able to recast it for free without having to use up a card, without having to spend any mana other than just casting the Sheoldred itself, is really good. Like, if it's stapled to a card that did its job on turn 2 and removed the thing that you need to remove on turn 2. So at the end of the day, I don't think it matters that much that the removal side of this card doesn't have the same ceiling as some other pieces of removal that can just hit any target or can go to the head in the case of Lightning Strike and stuff like that. I think the idea here is, if you're in a creature-based deck where your creatures are huge threats with huge targets on their head, it's just another thing they have to deal with down the line or else they lose. on top of your I killed the creature I needed to kill on turn 2 piece of removal. So I think that makes this card really good. And the fact that you actually surveil one every time something dies as well, even though it's kind of just gravy, it shouldn't go unnoticed, because that means by the time you sack this, you have 5 extra cards in the graveyard. You have even more targets to choose from. And you can almost make sure this never whiffs because of that. I think if it didn't have the surveil and it had a chance that it could just whiff by the time you get to 5, it wouldn't be quite as good. But with the surveil sort of as a backup plan, I think that adds even more value. And then if you're in a deck that wants to surveil for other reasons, it adds even more value. If you're in a deck that cares about enchantments, like a Hollowed Haunting deck, maybe Mardu enchantments or whatever, it adds even more value. If you have a way to flicker enchantments, you can get it to trigger again, kill something else, which adds even more value. There's all these little ways of getting upside on this card. So I think at the end of the day, it is way better than it first appears, way better than anyone's giving it credit for. You just have to view it in the right light. You have to compare it to like a card like Cut Down, something that's going to specifically be good on curve and not necessarily later on in the game. Because the other side of the card, the thing that's getting you back your threats, that's the part of it that's going to be good later in the game. Next up, we've got Breakout. I love this card. It's absolutely insane. 1 green, 1 red for a sorcery. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them. If that card has mana value 2 or less, you may put it onto the battlefield and it gains haste until end of turn. If you didn't put the revealed card onto the battlefield this way, you put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this does a lot. As long as your deck has enough really valuable aggressive 2-drops that it can consistently hit one in the top 6, this is going to be gnarly, because you end up spending the same amount of mana as you would to just play that 2-drop from your hand, but it's got haste for free, and you get card selection, so maybe you find a better 2-drop than what you otherwise would have to be just stuck playing on turn 2, because maybe it's the only 2-drop creature in your hand, right? So the card selection and the free haste, and you don't lose a card, right? Because you spend Breakout, but it finds another card from your library and puts it into place. So it's not card disadvantage either. I think all of that together makes it super, super good. You just need to be able to consistently hit a 2-drop, which means you probably want 1 in every 6 cards is 10. So you're going to probably want to have a safe buffer, I would say 15 at least, 15 2-drops in your deck. But as long as you have 10 or more, it's safe to at least try this card. And what's cool about it too is it has a fail state. Like, even if you don't find a 2-drop creature, you could find a bigger creature and just put it into your hand. So it's still card advantage in that way, or card selection rather. It's kind of a pseudo tutor, even when it fails. And I think that's what really pushes this card over the edge and helps it be a real contender. I have a brew with this card that I'm super excited to use it with. It is a domain deck, but it is a Gruul deck, and it uses another card we're going to talk about a little bit later in this video. I'm super excited about it. Let's move on. Next up, we've got Buried in the Garden. 1 white, 1 green, and 2 for an enchantment aura. It enchants a land. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent you don't control until Buried in the Garden leaves the battlefield. And whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of any color. This is a lot to unpack. Let me drink some coffee. So, the card I want to compare this to is Binding the Old Gods. And Binding the Old Gods proved that it was an absolute contender and a monster of a card, and it saw a ton of play when it was in Standard. And what Binding of the Old Gods did was, for the same 4, mana value here, 4 mana cost, it would destroy any permanent on the first turn that you play it. The next turn it would fetch you a land with a basic land type. And then on the third turn, it would give everything Death Touch. And I would argue that that third ability of the saga, giving everything Death Touch, was very inconsequential. It barely ever made a difference. It was very, very silver lining, like never really came up. Really, the people that ran that card and the reason it was so good and it got so much use was because get rid of any threat for 4 mana, and then next turn, ramp yourself by putting an extra land into play. Now, I think this is just strictly better than that. Not only can it still hit any target for 4 mana, but instead of destroying it, it exiles it, so you don't get any death triggers. They don't have the ability to interact with it in the graveyard, maybe get it back with a Reanimator deck or whatever. It's just gone. So that's better. And then the fact that the enchanted land that you put it on can tap for an additional mana of any color, I actually think is better than fetching a new land. Now, with the case of Binding the Old Gods, fetching the land, not only do you have to pick a land with a basic land type, so at most you're getting a land that can produce 3 colors, whereas this makes all 5, but you also have to wait until the next turn to do that, and then it comes into play tapped, so you have to wait another turn to use it, whereas Buried in the Garden, if you have 5 lands already on the field, you just play this on the one that's still untapped, and you can use it that very turn. You get that extra mana right away, so you can play a 2-drop. You know, if you're turn 5 and you play this on your one untapped land, you can then follow it up by playing a 2-drop. And even if you don't, even if you rush this out on turn 4 to deal with a threat, you can immediately tap the land for extra mana the next turn, instead of whereas in Binding the Old Gods case, the land is tapped that turn. That would be the turn that you're fetching it, so you can't use it that turn. So I think these upside actually make this card better than Binding the Old Gods. And if I'm right about that, then this is going to see a ton of play, because Binding the Old Gods saw a ton of play. So I'm kind of excited to see if I'm right. Now, there are a couple of little bits of downside where it's not strictly better than Binding the Old Gods. For example, the fact that this exiles something as long as it's on the battlefield means if they do have enchantment removal, they can get the thing back. That's not going to happen very often, but it is a possible way to make this card a little bit worse. But I do think it's canceled out by the strengths of the card. And then the other thing is, because you're not fetching a land like with Binding the Old Gods, you're not getting a landfall trigger. But I don't think that's going to come up very often at all. I don't think that's super relevant. So again, I think it's canceled out by the strengths of this card. So even though it's not like strictly better than Binding the Old Gods, I think in most cases it's going to function the same way and be better. Definitely slam this in Limited. It's a crazy pick for Limited. I'm going to try to brew with it in Constructed as well. Next up, we have our first split cards. That's right, split cards have returned. I was thinking about making a new scene for the split cards so that we could look at them horizontal, but to be honest, these set reviews have been exhausting and taken a lot of work, so I will have that scene ready for the next set in case we get more of cards like this that need to be horizontal. But for this one, we're just going to look at them like this. Now, the first thing that I want to note about these split cards is the fact that they exist within a set that cares about converted mana cost in the graveyard with the Collect Evidence cards. And because of that, you need to understand that whenever this card is in your library, in your graveyard, in your hand, anywhere but on the stack, basically, it's going to count as the combined attributes of both sides of the card, which means the converted mana cost of this is the 2 mana from the Cease side and the 6 mana from the Desist side, so that makes this 8 mana cost, right? So for Collect Evidence, if you exile this card, it counts as collecting evidence 8, and that's huge, and I think that's actually the #1 reason why these cards are in this set, and the most likely to be overlooked part of them. So keep that in mind when you're drafting. If you're going into a Collect Evidence style build, these split cards are going to go way up in value. So on the Cease side, you have 1 Golgari hybrid mana and 1 for an instant. Exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. Target player gains 2 life and draws a card. What's cool about this is sort of like the plan B of the card, right? Because the other side is Desist. 2 Selesnya hybrid mana and 4, so a total of 6 for a sorcery. Destroy all artifacts and enchantments. So what this card lets you do, it gives you access to artifact and enchantment wipe in your main deck without wasting a card. Because if you happen to be in a situation where destroying all artifacts and enchantments isn't going to do anything for you, at the very least you can cast Cease and gain 2 life and draw a card to draw into something else, since this card isn't super useful for you. And then also get a little bit of silver lining value by being able to exile 2 cards, and that could matter. That could take away your opponent's ability to collect evidence and that sort of thing. So I like the idea here of you have this really powerful spell against very specific decks, but if you're not up against that deck, you have a really cool plan B where gain a little bit of life to make up for aggro, draw into a new card, and get rid of, you know, the best cards in your opponent's graveyard. So I think this card's a slam dunk. Like I said, if you're in Collect Evidence, you want to snag as many of these split cards as possible. Next up, we've got Coerce to Kill. 1 black, 1 blue, and 3 for an enchantment aura. Enchants a creature you control. Enchants any creature, and then you control the enchanted creature. The enchanted creature has base power and toughness 1/1, has death touch, and is an assassin in addition to its other types. This card's pretty wild. 5 mana is a lot if the thing that you're stealing is becoming a 1/1. So, I mean, this isn't nowhere near the power level of older cards like Control Magic that did something like this. But still, being able to steal a creature from your opponent means that they're losing a threat, their best threat, and you're gaining a threat at the same time for 1 card. So it's automatic card advantage that removes their biggest threat and automatically 2-for-1s you. And I think that's really strong. And unless they have enchantment removal, like, they can't really do anything about it. Now, if they do have enchantment removal, it's pretty rough because when it goes back to their side and it's not enchanted anymore, it does become the normal creature and it's not just a 1/1 anymore. And that's a little scary. But I think the chances of them having enchantment removal are low enough that this card is still going to be really powerful in Limited and should be probably considered. The Death Touch is relevant too because in Limited this can be a really good blocker. Not only do you take away their best attacker, but then you shut down their ability to swing with their other big attackers because you can just chump block with the Death Toucher and trade, and then you don't have to worry about them killing the enchantment, right? So it's going to be really good used in that way in Limited, but I'm also interested in trying to use this in Constructed in an Assassin Tribal deck, because specifically it turns the creature into a 1/1 death-touching assassin, which lines up perfectly with what the Assassin Tribal deck wants to do, and we'll talk about that when we get to Atrada, which is like the main card that the Assassin Tribal deck's going to hinge around, so we'll wait until then, but as far as Limited is concerned, I think this card is absolutely worth trying, and if enchantment removal ends up being too prevalent, it might not be as valuable, but for now, on launch day, I do think it's going to be a very high pick, get you a ton of value in your Limited game. Next up, we have Crowd Control Warden. 1 white, 1 green, and 3 for a 4/4 Centaur Soldier. As he enters the battlefield or is turned face up, you put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of other creatures you control. This guy's pretty good because the ability triggers on unmasking or being played. You have the ability to play it 2 different ways. If you top deck this later in the game and you've got a big board, you can just slam it and it's just a huge creature right off the bat, right? But if you get this earlier on curve and you don't have a lot of creatures out yet, you don't have to wait. You can put it into play as a 2/2 ward 2 for 3 and still have a creature on the field and then just wait to unmask it later on when you have more creatures on the field and can get more counters off of it. So there's this nice versatility in how it can be used. And then the most notable part of this is the fact that in order to unmask it, it takes 2 Selesnya hybrid mana, which means you don't have to be in Selesnya to play this card. You could be playing a green deck without white or a white deck without green in Limited and very easily use this guy and play them as a disguise creature and still be able to flip them up, even if you're lacking one color or the other. And I think that makes this card a lot better than it otherwise would be because of the versatility. Now, you are going to want to be in a deck that's going wide, because if this ever has to hit the field by itself, a 4/4 for 5 is not good. But if you are in a very go wide deck, I think this guy is a slam dunk as, you know, you're 1 or 2 of at your top end to really capitalize on that. So I wouldn't first pick him, but if you're in that go wide deck, I think he's one of the higher pick commons you could probably choose. Next up, we have Curious Cadaver, a 3/1 zombie detective with flying for 1 black, 1 blue, and 2. When you sacrifice a clue, you return Curious Cadaver from your graveyard to your hand. This is going to be way too slow and constructed, but in Limited, I think this guy is really good. Even if you're not going super wide with clues, if you have a few incidental clue things in your deck, a 3/1 flyer that can come back a couple times over the course of the game, help make your opponent waste removal or maybe trade with key cards, is going to be pretty effective. So I think it does depend on, you have to be in Dimir, obviously, and I think it does depend on having enough clue support. But at the same time, I don't think it depends on having like an insane, like totally focused on clue style deck. You know, if you have a handful of cards in your deck where consistently in any given game, you're going to get 2 or 3 clue tokens, then I think this guy is worth the inclusion as a recursive threat that has evasion that's just really hard to deal with over the long term. So if you're in that kind of archetype, definitely consider drafting this guy high. Outside of that, probably a lot lower. Next up, we have Deadly Complication. 1 red, 1 black, and 1 for a sorcery. Choose one or both. Destroy target creature. Put a +1/+1 counter on target suspected creature you control. You may have it become no longer suspected. I think this card is just nuts. Just a 3 mana destroy target creature, no conditions, is going to be really good in limited, and a very, very high pick. But the fact that you can get some free extra value off this card in the right scenario, if your opponent's trying to suspect your creatures, make it so they can't block, like you can get rid of that and get another counter without having to give up destroying a creature because you can choose both. So having that extra ability just sort of like on hold, like ready to go if you need it, on a card that's already worth playing for the first ability, just makes this super good. So in limited, take this really, really high if you know you're going to be in Rakdos, and it's just always going to put in work for you, and sometimes it's going to do even more. Next up, we've got Detective Satchel. 1 red, 1 blue, and 2 for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, investigate twice, and you can tap it to create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, but activate only if you sacrificed an artifact this turn. This is a good example of a card that, if rotation in Standard had happened normally and we had our 2-year rotation, wouldn't be as powerful. But you got to remember, this is coming into a Standard format where we have access to Oni-Cult Anvil still. So the downside of this card is it doesn't have a way to sacrifice an artifact itself on its own without having to spend mana, right? It can just tap to make a 1/1 flyer if you've sacrificed an artifact. And it specifically has to be sacrificed, not just like if an artifact went to the graveyard or whatever. So there are limitations, and I think outside of Oni-Cult Anvil, that makes this card a lot more balanced and harder to use. It's a lot more reliant on things like clue tokens or blood tokens, where you have to specifically sacrifice these artifacts in order to be able to use the Detective Satchel. But because we have Oni-Cult Anvil, like, you just get an extra 1/1 flyer every time you use your Oni-Cult Anvil, and when you play this card, it gives you 3 artifacts right off the bat, the Satchel itself and 2 clue tokens. That just seems like a lot of value. So Grixis Anvil, I think, is absolutely worth experimenting with and seeing what we can do with it. Even in limited, I think this card's going to be pretty good as long as you're deep enough into artifacts that can sack, which will mostly be clues. But if you're looking to sacrifice artifacts consistently, like at the very least every other turn, like an endless stream of 1/1 flying Thopters is nothing to scoff at. So I would say keep this in mind if you're in the, slanted very much into the clue tribal theme in limited. But otherwise, I mean, in constructed, I'm just really looking forward to seeing what this card can do. And I'm also really looking forward to taking a swig of my coffee because I've been talking a lot and I'm thirsty. Nectar of the Gods. Moving on, we've got Dogwalker. This card is bananas for a common. 3/1 human citizen with vigilance for 1 white and 1 red. That's already pretty good, like at common, right? I feel like something this good would be very, very close at least to uncommon. Maybe not quite uncommon as a 3/1 vigilance for 2, but close, right? But then it also has disguise, and it can disguise for 2 Boros hybrid mana, and when it's turned face up, you get to create 2 tapped 1/1 white dog creature tokens. So not only can this just come down as a 3/1 Vigilance on 2 to be aggressive in your aggressive deck if it's your best 2-drop on 2, but it could just come down on 3 as a 2/2 Ward 2 that's hard for your opponent to get rid of. And then maybe by the time they can, you can just flip it up in response and they lose their removal spell and you get 2 1/1 white dogs. Or maybe you don't even wait for in response. Maybe they swing in with a 3/3 and you flip this up for just 2 mana, trade with their 3/3, kind of blow them out and get 2 dogs. Like, the fact that this can just be played as a 2-drop or played as a 3-drop and then have the trickiness of the disguise and then have extra value in the form of dogs on top of that, it's just a lot of versatility in one common. So I think this guy is probably one of the better commons. It's also worth noting this is another hybrid mana disguise cost, so you don't have to be in red or white to use this. You just have to have one or the other in your deck, and then you're good to go. You can just play it as the disguise creature and turn it face up for double red or double white. So I'm kind of loving this cycle of cards where you don't need to be in both colors in order to get value off of it later in the game. You just need to be in both colors in order to, hard cast it. Next up, we've got Doppelgang. This card's wild, and I've got some stuff I want to try with it. 1 blue, 1 green, and triple X. That's right, Vin Diesel up in here. For a sorcery, for each of X target permanents, you create X tokens that are copies of that permanent. That means if you pay a total of 5 mana, you get to make 1 copy of one thing. If you pay a total of 8 mana, you get to make 2 copies of 2 different things each, 2 of one and 2 of the other. If you pay a total of 11 mana, you get to make 3 copies each of 3 different things. So 3 of that, 3 of that, 3 of that. It escalates into insanity. It does require a lot of mana, but there are some really cool ways to use this. The way I'm excited to try and break it, so to speak, is maybe with Hanada, because for each target that when Hanada's on the field, you reduce the cost by 1. So what that basically does is take this from a triple X spell and change it into a double X spell, which is way, way, way more manageable, right? And then on top of that, you could do something like play Awaken the Woods, where not only is Awaken the Woods going to be another way to take advantage of a bunch of mana you're making for an X spell. If you're already trying to do that with this, that's another card that can give you a payoff for generating all that mana. But if you Awaken the Woods first, you're making a whole bunch of mana dorks that can then tap for even more mana to use when you finally play Doppelgang. So it's like synergistic in 2 different ways, which is really cool. So I kind of wonder if a weird 4-color Hanada Doppelgang Awaken the Woods brew is possible. Maybe we even throw in the blue artifact that, I forget the name of it. Let me know in the comments below if you remember the name, but it's a blue artifact that at the end of your turn you put an oil counter on it, and then for each oil counter on it, it reduces the cost of instants and sorceries by 1. All of those cards could probably fit pretty well into a deck with that as well. Some combination of these cards are absolutely going to end up in a brew of mine sometime in the first week or 2 of launch. And we're going to see what we can do with it. It has the potential to just turn into complete and utter shenanigans, but it could be pretty insane if we can pull it off. So I'm going to try it. Next up, we've got Drag the Canal. 1 black and 1 blue for an instant. You create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. And if a creature died this turn, you gain 2 life, surveil 2, and then investigate. I think this card is just a lot of value. Here's the thing. All of the things that this gives you isn't anything to write home about just by itself, right? But it's the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? If you're able to play this in maybe a control deck where you're just trying to stave off aggro, right? And you're able to play it on a turn where something of yours did die, it doesn't even have to be something of yours. It could be any creature that died, so it could be your opponent's creature that died, which is worth considering. It might be completely usable to just like play this in a control deck or whatever, right? And remove their threat with like a cut down, and then play Drag the Canal and make a 2/2 blocker, gain 2 life, make a clue token to get you card advantage later on, surveil 2 so that you can scry into what you need. Like, that's a ton of value and completely helps you stave off aggro in huge ways. So I don't think this is a card where like it's going to set the world on fire and do anything that's ooh or ah worthy, but I do think it's a workhorse. And over time, as people start to realize just how much value this gives under the right circumstances, I do think you're going to start to see this card show up more and more and more in standard constructed decks where they can get that value and really use this to just kind of hose aggro at the very least. But even if you're not up against aggro, you can, you know, still investigate, still get value off of this. And the card's just really versatile and gives a lot of power for just 2 mana. It's just not splashy power. It's not like ooh ah. So I don't think a lot of people are talking about it. But I do think the longer that the set's out, the more and more people are going to start to realize that this is like a staple. Almost, I don't want to go as far as to say Fable of the Mirror Breaker in a Fable of the Mirror Breaker kind of way, but it is giving me vibes of like Fable didn't seem like it was that good at first, but then you just realize the more you play with it, just how much little bits of value it gives that all add up to like a must-play card. And I think this gives the same sort of vibes, not to the nearly the same degree as Fable, but in a little bit. It gives me vibes of Fable in that like people don't realize how good it is, because all of these little things are just going to matter so much in the early game, I think. But I don't know. We'll have to see. Next up, we've got Atrada, Deadly Fugitive. Now, this is that assassin I was talking about earlier in the video. 1 black, 1 blue, and 1 for a 1/4 legendary vampire assassin with Death Touch. It has face down creatures you control have the ability to pay 1 black, 1 blue, and 2, turn this creature face up. And if you can't, you exile it, and then you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. Also, whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent, you cloak the top card of that player's library. So this is super powerful. If you can get in for damage with assassins, you can start cloaking the cards from the top of your opponent's library, and then you just have to pay 4 mana to flip them, no matter what they cost, even if they're not a creature. Because what happens is, say you hit an Atraxa on the top of your opponent's library. Well, now you just pay 4 mana to flip the Atraxa, and that's pretty wild. But if you don't hit an Atraxa, say you hit Breach the Multiverse, you still pay the 4 mana. It tries to turn it face up and says, oh, I can't. So it becomes exiled, and then you get to play it for free. So you basically get a 4 mana Breach the Multiverse. That's how this card works, and that's pretty nutty. The only real downside is the fact that you have to do damage with assassins. So in order to make this card work the best it possibly can, you want to be playing with assassins that your opponent does not want to block or is having a hard time blocking, especially if you can play them on turn 2, so that you can immediately slam Atrada on turn 3 and then swing in with your assassin that doesn't have summoning sickness and start to get value off this right away. That makes it really powerful. But even just the fact that it has such a high toughness of 4 and Death Touch itself means even if you don't have other assassins to combo it with, it's still a pretty relevant threat. They can't swing into it with a big threat without you being able to kill it, and you can survive anything that's less than 4 power coming in, and if you attack, they have to either chump block or lose a 4 power creature trading with this in order to prevent you from cloaking a card from the top. So even by itself, it gives a lot of value, but if you can really double down on the assassin theme and go nuts with it, this guy can be super crazy. I'm absolutely going to brew this. It's going to be super fun. Next up, we've got Evidence Examiner. 1 blue, 1 green for a 2/2 Merfolk Detective. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may collect evidence 4, and whenever you collect evidence, you investigate. Now, ignore the first part of the ability at the start here. The main thing here is you have a 2/2 for 2 that anytime you collect evidence with your other collect evidence cards, you're going to get to investigate. It's just strict extra value, right? Like, you're collecting evidence for your other collect evidence cards for whatever you're getting from them, and that's should be very, very worth it on its own. The fact that now you get an extra clue token every single time you do that is pretty good. Like, this card's just going to give you a ton of value over the course of the game if you're in the collect evidence archetype. But then on top of that, you get a little bit of extra value in that if you want to, if you have plenty of evidence in your graveyard and you don't consider it a waste, when this enters, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you just collect evidence 4 and get a clue token. So it's ways to trigger itself, even if you aren't drawing into your collect evidence cards, or if you're out of gas or whatever, you still have a way to get some value off of this card every single turn if you need to. And I think that's pretty powerful. And it's also worth noting that collect evidence 4, it's very easy to get in the mindset of thinking that's going to require 4 whole cards, and that you're going to run out of gas really quick for collect evidence. But that's not the case. If you have just one 4-drop in your graveyard, you can just exile just that one card and it will count. So it's worth taking that into account and keeping that in mind, where this collect evidence 4 isn't as bad as I think it initially appears on the surface, at least the way I interpret it. My gut is always to feel like that collect evidence 4 is a bigger commitment than it really is. So overall, I think this card is kind of another sleeper in that it just gives you so much value over the course of the game if you're in that archetype. So obviously, if you're not in that archetype, this is okay. It can still give you some free value. In fact, if you have nothing else to use the cards in your graveyard for, you have no reason not to collect evidence for and just get free clue tokens. So I think even if you're not in that archetype, this guy can be pretty good. Yeah, the more I think about it, I think this guy just wants to go in every Simic deck. In the collect evidence deck, he gives you free value, and if you're not in the collect evidence deck, you're not using those cards for anything anyway, and it still gives you free value. So yes, play this card. Play this card. Next up, we've got Ezim, Agency Chief. 2 blue, 2 white, and 1 for a 5/5 legendary Archon detective with flying. When he enters the battlefield, you investigate twice, and then you can pay 1 and sack an artifact to give it your choice of Vigilance, Lifelink, or Hexproof until end of turn. This card is kind of nutty. Even if you slam this on 5 and they remove it right away, you're left with 2 clue tokens. So it's an automatic kind of 3-for-1 card advantage. Even if they play a sweeper, you're left with the clue tokens. And if they don't play a sweeper, you could always just sacrifice one of those clue tokens to give this hexproof if they're trying to use traditional removal on it. And so not only do you waste one of their removal spells, you still have the other clue token, and you still have your Ezim, which is kind of gnarly. It can also be flickered to give you 2 clue tokens every single time you flicker it, which is kind of wild. And then you have some extra upside of, even beyond the hexproof, if you're against like an aggro deck or whatever, and you're not worried about them having removal that can hit this, maybe they've got shocks or lightning strikes or whatever, and you're not worried, like, you can just give it Vigilance and or Lifelink instead, and just one hit with this, with Lifelink, especially if it also has Vigilance and it's still up as a blocker, is just, that's just the death knell for aggro, right? So I think what I love about this card so much is that it's really good against any style deck. Aggro in mid-range, it's an absolute beast, but then even against control, it gives you 2 clue tokens, even if they deal with this, and then usually they have to use a sweeper to deal with it because you can give it hexproof. There's just so much value here no matter what kind of deck you're up against. I think this is a real contender for being like the win condition in an Azorius control deck moving forward. I think if we were on a 2-year rotation, like, it would be a slam dunk, like it would be the win condition. I think the card pool is so big and the card quality is so high in this 3-year rotation that I'm a little bit more on the fence, but it's still a super powerful card and definitely has the potential to be like the card as the win condition in these control decks. So yes, play the damn thing. Fairy Snoop, 1 black, 1 blue, and 1 for a 1/4 fairy detective with flying. Disguises for 2 Dimir mana and 1 colorless, and whenever it's turned face up, you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So even as a 1/4 flyer for 3, this isn't awful as a common, right? If you're just looking to like flesh out your deck with flyers or defensive creatures, if you're in a very control based deck where you're trying to just survive long enough to hit your bombs or whatever, like, a 1/4 flyer for 3 isn't awful to begin with. It's not first pickable by any means, but it can absolutely be used to fill out your deck. But the fact that you have the versatility here of playing it as a ward creature, and the fact that it doesn't have to be in a Dimir deck, it can be in a deck that has just blue as one of the primary colors or just black as one of the primary colors, because you can just disguise it and flip it up. The versatility here is just great, and the fact that you get card advantage when you do turn it face up, and not only do you get the best of the top 2 cards into your hand, but you get to put the other one in your graveyard to fuel things like Collect Evidence. I think all around there's just a lot to love about this card. I think it is one of the better commons for sure, and I think if you're in base blue or base black, you want to pick this up even if you're not in Dimir. It's going to be really great for limited. Next up, we've got another split card. This is Flatsome Jetsam. So the Flotsam side is an instant that lets you mill 3 cards and then investigate. So this is like another really good plan B style. If you can't get Jetsam to work, you can play Flotsam and at least put some stuff in your yard for Collect Evidence, and, you know, get yourself a clue token to replace this card with another drawn card eventually. But it's worth having that as your plan B if your plan A is Jetsam, which is 6 mana with 2 Dimir hybrid mana. For sorcery, each opponent mills 3 cards, and then you may cast a spell from each opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If a spell cast this way would be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. Now, notice it doesn't say non-creature spell. This is literally 6 mana, your opponent mills 3, you get the best thing in their graveyard for free. Doesn't even have to be a permanent, it can be a Breach the Multiverse, it could be whatever. You just get the best card out of their graveyard, which maybe it was already in there, maybe it's one of the 3 milled cards. The extra 3 milled cards that you get just adds more choices to what you can hit and makes it so it's not ever completely dead, even if their graveyard's empty. So there's a lot to love about this card. The fact that this can be an absolute bomb in the late game, but not be useless earlier in the game because it can replace itself with a clue token and help, you know, mill a little bit to support those kinds of strategies. It's another slam dunk. It's also another card that's worth 8 mana in the graveyard for Collect Evidence. So I think if you're in the Collect Evidence deck, yes, play it, grab it. Another split card, we've got Fuss and Bother. Fuss is 1 Boros split mana and 2 for an instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. Again, I feel like the first card of the 2 halves is sort of like the plan B, although maybe it isn't. If you're in an aggressive deck, being able to give everything +1/+1 is pretty good, but the fact that they're counters and they stay forever is actually kind of really good. But then if you don't have any creatures, then you have the Bother side. For 2 Azorius hybrid mana and 4, so a total of 6, you can cast a sorcery that creates 3 1/1 colorless artifact Thopters with flying, and also lets you surveil 2. So, I mean, the backside is expensive, but if you top deck this late in the game, getting 3 1/1 flyers and kind of digging a couple cards into your deck to find the best possible card to follow that up with is not nothing. So the fact that you can do that if you don't have creatures, and it gives you these win conditions, these evasive win conditions, or if you do have creatures, you can just pump the whole board with the Fuss side. I love the options here. It's 2 very specific board states and scenarios that can make use of either, and if you're in a deck that can make use of either of these modes, it's going to be super good. Definitely play this if you're in the go wide deck, because getting a counter on everything for that 3 mana at instant speed as a trick is kind of gnarly, especially when you have Bother as a backup plan, a plan B. Next up, we've got Gadget Technician, 1 red, 1 blue, and 2 for a 3/2 Goblin Artificer. When Gadget Technician enters the battlefield or is turned face up, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. This is just great. You know, if you get this later, you can just pay the 4, slam it as a 3/2, and get a 1/1 flyer. Now you have a body that can trade with a 3 toughness creature, and you still have the 1/1 flyer pinging in for damage every turn. Like, that's not bad. It's obviously going to be better if you disguise it first, because then you can flip it up for just 2 mana at instant speed, catch them with their pants down when they're swinging with a 3/3, thinking this is only a 2/2, right? Not only that, but you get the Thopter at instant speed, and the Thopter doesn't come in tapped like some of the other token makers do when you unmask them from being disguised. So even the Thopter can block. If they're swinging with a 4/4, you know, you could block with both and just trade with the 4/4. So there's a versatility in how this can be used. It can be a combat trick. It can come out early. It can go in decks that are just blue or just red that don't use both because it can just be disguised. So another one of those cards, there's a lot of versatility. I think it's worth considering. I don't think it's a super high pick. But as far as a common that you're just trying to flesh out that 22nd, 23rd card in your deck and find playables, you could do a lot worse than this guy, and I think he's absolutely worth considering running. Next up, we've got Gleaming Gear Drake. This card is bananas. 1/1 artifact creature Drake with flying for 1 red and 1 blue. When he enters the battlefield, you investigate. And whenever you sacrifice an artifact, you put a +1/+1 counter on Gleaming Gear Drake. I'll drink to that. So first of all, as soon as he enters the battlefield, you get 2 artifacts. For 2 mana and only using up 1 card in your hand, you get 2 artifacts on the field. That's going to matter a lot for Artifact Matters decks that really want to go wide with artifacts, for things like Chico's Reign of Truth, Teething Wormlet, Oni-Cult Anvil, all that kind of stuff. But then the fact that this triggers and gets counters every time you sack an artifact, it's important to note it's not an activated ability where you sacrifice the artifact in order to put a +1/+1 counter on this. It's just whenever an artifact is sacrificed for another benefit, you get a +1/+1 counter. So you get to use your Oni-Cult Anvil and get the drain from that and still get the counter. You know, you get to crack your clue token, still draw the card, and also get the counter. So the fact that you can preserve the value of these artifacts that you're sacking and what you're sacking them for, and just get free +1/+1 counters every single time on an evasive body that has flying that only cost you 2 mana and came into play with another artifact that's not only 2 artifacts on the field for 2 mana, but one of them is card advantage that you can crack later on to draw a card, which means this thing 2-for-1s, like, it just does everything. It does everything you want in a go wide artifact deck. It's absolutely bananas. Grixis Anvil's coming. Let's do it. That's it. That's all you need to know. In Limited, I mean, you got to be into the clue token theme pretty substantially, I think. Or maybe some of the other artifact sacrifice shenanigans. Things like crime novelists and stuff like that. If you're into that sort of archetype, you definitely want to slam this. But even outside of that, I mean, if you're Izzet and you can at least consistently get a couple clues or sacrificable artifacts onto the field over the course of a game, I still think this is worth playing. Even just a 1/1 flyer that draws you a card later and becomes a 2/2 flyer when you do it is super good, even if you're not in the archetype, right? If you have 1 or 2 other clue tokens over the course of the game that then makes this into like a 3/3 or potentially even a 4/4, like, that's still insane. But at its base, it's eventually a 2/2 flyer that drew you a card, which, I don't know. I just think it's nuts. I think you slam it if you're in Izzet, and it makes you want to play even more clue tokens if you do. Next up, we've got Granite Witness. 1 blue, 1 white, and 2 for a 3/2 artifact creature gargoyle detective with flying and vigilance. That's a lot. Disguise for 2 Azorius hybrid mana, and whenever it's turned face up, you may tap or untap target creature. This is just a good threat. Like, 3 power evasive creature with vigilance for 4 mana is kind of okay on its own. The fact that it counts as an artifact is sort of a little bit of upside too for the decks that are going to care about that. And then the fact that you can disguise it is even more upside. And when you turn it face up, you use it as a combat trick, you know, your opponent doesn't see it coming, you get to tap or untap a creature, so you can do it defensively. Tap down the thing that they're going to attack with, or defensively untap your really good blocker to block their thing that they're attacking with and blow them out. Or you can use it offensively to tap down their blocker when you're swinging, or to untap a creature that you've already used an ability of, so now it can swing as well. There's just like so much versatility in how this can be used, and I think having all of that versatility stapled to a card that's good enough on its own as a 3-power flying vigilance creature for 4, that's just a lot. Again, it gives me like charm vibes, where the reason charms are so good is not because each mode is like super, super good, but because you have the versatility of choosing the mode that's best depending on the game that you're playing at the moment, the board state at the moment. And I get similar vibes from this. It's got so many different ways you can use it, and you can choose the best way depending on how your game's going. And I think that just makes it really good, especially at common. Play this card in limited. Play it. Again, you don't need to be an Azorius to play it, just blue or white. So do that. This is another split card, Hustle and Bustle. Hustle's an instant for just 1 Izzet hybrid mana. Target creature attacks or blocks this turn if able. That's a nice little combat trick if you are set up to blow them out by forcing them to attack or block with something they don't want to, because you can kill it in combat, right? So having this as a plan B is pretty decent. It's never going to be plan A. It's going to be very situational, but it's attached to Bustle, which is 6 mana, 2 Gruul hybrid mana, and 4 for a sorcery. Creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. Until you may turn a creature you control face up. I'm trying to read these cards sideways, so yeah. That's really good. Like, Bustle, getting to take your best disguise creature and flip it up for free, while also just giving you an overrun effect, giving that creature as well as the rest of your team +2/+2 and trample. Like, this is just a game ender. It's a game ender with extra value on turning the thing face up that might be expensive to turn face up. So that card's just really good anyway. This is a good way of including an overrun style effect in your limited deck that can close out the game if you get it later on in the game without it being completely wasted early in the game. If you happen to have it early and you're not going to survive long enough to get to the turn where you want to cast Bustle, then there's at least a chance that you can use the Hustle side, right? And maybe blow out your opponent by forcing them to attack or block on a turn where it's really going to be detrimental to them. So I like that you have this plan B attached to the Bustle, and I think that makes the Bustle more desirable. Yeah, I think you run this card. If you're in a very creature-heavy deck where creatures are going to matter and you're really scrapping it out on the ground, both sides of this card are going to be useful. Next up, we've got Ill-Timed Explosion. 1 red, 1 blue, and 2 for a sorcery. Draw 2 cards. Then you may discard 2 cards. When you do, Ill-Timed Explosion deals X damage to each creature, where X is the greatest mana value among cards discarded this way. I think this is another sleeper. I think this card is kind of insane, and it's flying under the radar. So this is a 4 mana Izzet sweeper, right? You just have to discard something that has a high enough mana value that you wipe the board. But getting that versatility, getting to choose, like if you have a Sheoldred down and they've got a bunch of 4/4s, like maybe you get the option of discarding a 4-drop in your hand and killing all of their creatures and keeping your Sheoldred. So in that way, it can be a one-sided sweeper under the right circumstances, or it can just be a normal sweeper. But either way, you're also getting card selection while you're sweeping, and since it deals the X damage equal to the greatest mana value among cards, it means that second card that you discard doesn't have to be something super relevant. It can just be a land or whatever, and you're not going to get penalized for that, which is really nice. So you get this card selection, dig two cards deeper into your deck, get to wipe the board, 4/4 mana, the same cost as a Wrath. I think that's pretty powerful on its own. But I think the real reason that this card ends up being super good is because board wipes are always going to be good against aggro and usually good against mid-range, right? But when you're up against control decks, a lot of times they can be dead cards just sitting in your hand and doing nothing. But this card, at the very least, you could just play it as a 4-mana spell that draws you 2 cards. So if it's in your hand and you've got nothing to wipe and you're up against a control deck, it's not going to just sit there. At the very least, you can use it as card advantage. Replace this 1 card with 2 new cards that you draw, and it's actually useful against control. So the fact that you can use it that way, in addition to it being this cool sweeper that gets you card selection, I think that's what makes this card so much more valuable than it seems on the surface. I'm really excited to brew with it. I don't know exactly what deck I want to put it in yet, but it's giving me Narset vibes, the old 3-color Narset Planeswalker, and I loved that card. I used that all the time in Standard when it was legal, so I definitely want to try to brew some kind of a weird, maybe Jeskai control deck, or maybe some other 3-color control deck that utilizes this card, because I think it can be really good in the right deck. Next up, we've got Insidious Roots. Talk about being really good in the right deck. This is 1 green and 1 black for an enchantment, so it's just 2 mana. Creature tokens you control have tap to add 1 mana of any color. That by itself is already going to be super good in any deck that's just super token heavy, going super wide with tokens. Like, now all of a sudden you just slam this for 2 and you can make a crap ton of mana and play ridiculously expensive spells, like, out of nowhere when your opponent doesn't see it coming. But then you have this other line of text, right? Whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, you create a 0/1 green plant creature token and then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. That ability is just bananas in the right deck. Specifically, I'm thinking of my Willowgeist deck, which is already pretty powerful and has an embarrassment of options for really powerful cards to include in the deck. This set just brings even more craziness to that deck. Like, that deck's already constantly exiling stuff from the graveyard. If every single time you exile a creature card, you get another token, and then you buff up all those tokens, and all those tokens can also then tap for mana, like, that just seems insane to me. Like, it's worth noting, too, that that first plant that you make isn't really a 0/1. It's a 1/2, because it comes into play, but also gets a +1/+1 counter from that same activation, right? So, I don't know, man. This just seems wild. The first creature card you exile gives you a 1/2 creature that can tap for a mana of any color. And then every creature you exile after that gives you another creature, and they all scale, and they all get bigger. And because they all scale over time, it's not like the first one that you made is still small, and it's only each new one is getting bigger and bigger. All of them are getting counters, so they're all getting really big. Once you've exiled 5 or 6 cards, you've got 5 and 6 power tokens on the board. You've got like 5 or 6 of them. And it's just like, that can get out of hand for just a 2-drop. Like, you just paid 2 mana and put this thing down and got all this value over the game. Now, you're obviously going to have to be building a deck that can make use of this. You're going to have to be in specific archetypes. Specifically in Constructed is where this is going to work best. But if you're in those archetypes, you can make great use. And I just love that this card can be brewed in 2 completely different ways. You could just go into a deck where you're super wide with tokens and don't even care about exiling things from the graveyard and get value that way. Or you can go into a thing that isn't making a lot of other tokens, but is really good at constantly exiling creatures from the graveyard and just go super wide with these plants and super tall, like way faster than your opponent anticipates. And you can just like build a deck that way. It's going to be really interesting to see if we can kind of find the middle ground. Can we find a deck where we're able to focus on one of these parts of the cards to a high degree and get the absolute most out of it, but then still include some cards that work with the other ability, the other half of the card, so to speak? That's where the brewing is going to get really interesting, to see just how well we can glue together both of these abilities into the same deck without losing the absolute maximum potential of one of the abilities specifically. So I'm excited to brew with this. It's going to be wild. Obviously, we're going to do Willowgeist deck first because it's just so perfect for that. But I have a feeling that in the coming weeks, there are going to be multiple different really cool deck ideas that utilizes this card. And I'm excited. I'm looking forward to that. Next up, we've got Izoni, Center of the Web. 1 green, 1 black, and 4 for a 5/4 legendary elf detective with menace. When Izoni enters the battlefield or attacks, you may collect evidence 4. If you do, create 2 2/1 black and green spider creature tokens with menace and reach. You can also sacrifice 4 of any tokens to surveil 2, and then draw 2 cards, and you gain 2 life, and take a swig of your Nectar of the Gods. Can we just take a second? It's so good. It's so good, and my throat is so tired. 6 mana is a lot, right? 6 mana is a lot. But this does give you a lot of value right away. Again, you look at that collect evidence 4, and it's easy for your gut instinct to feel like that's a lot, and that you're only going to get so many activations off of it, and maybe you don't even get an activation the turn you play it because you don't have enough in the graveyard yet. Like, it's my gut instinct to, like, feel that way about the card, but I actually think in practice, it's going to be really easy to collect evidence 4. And even if you just do this the one time when it comes into play, you're getting a 5/4 menace and 2 2/1 menace reach creatures for 1 card. So even if they remove Izoni at that point, you still got kind of like 3 for 1 value. And if you're able to just attack once with her and trigger it again, you get 2 more tokens. And you have this ability to sack them. So not only do you now have 4 2/1 menace reach creatures left over if they kill Izoni, but you have the alternate use of, maybe if you want, you can sacrifice all 4 of those spiders, surveil 2, draw 2 cards, gain 2 life. So now if they're going to sweep the board, Sunfall or whatever, you can sacrifice all 4 spiders in response and draw some cards, scry closer to your better cards with the surveil 2, and gain a little bit of life as well. Like, the fact that you can do that against a Sunfall or any sweeper gives this card a lot more resiliency, and the more you start to think about the little ways in which this can get value, the more it starts to really feel like it's actually worth the 6 mana. So I feel like this card looks like a trap on the surface. It looks like it's too expensive for having hoops to jump through in order to get the value, but I think at the end of the day, when you actually play it, it's going to work super well. It's going to give you Lolth vibes, and I would not be surprised if this ends up being a lot better in constructed a couple weeks from now, when people have actually seen what it can do, than it will, like, on day 1. So we'll see where this card goes, but it is a ton of value. 6 mana is a lot, but if you can play it, you're going to get a lot out of it. Next up, we've got Judith, Carnage Connoisseur. 1 red, 1 black, and 3 for a 3/4 legendary human shaman. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, choose one. That spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink, or you create a 2/2 red imp creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So, this card's really good, but at the same time, it's really expensive, and I don't know what to think of it. On the one hand, you want to play this in a deck with a lot of instants and sorceries, which means you have less creatures in the deck, which means there's a better chance that by the time you play this, your opponent still has removal in their hand. And if they still have removal in their hand, they use removal on your 5-drop before you get to use its abilities, and it feels really bad. Not only that, but if you don't get to use its abilities, like really turn those abilities up to 11 and get the most out of them, it's just a 3/4 body for 5. So you really have to, like, focus and double down on these abilities by playing it in a deck that just utilizes a ton of instants and sorceries, right? Or else the card's not really worth playing, because outside of that ability, it's just super, super underrated. But then if you are in that ability, like I said, there's a greater chance your opponent has creature removal, and that's kind of rough. I think there is room for this card, though. The fact that if you're playing a burn spell, you can get Death Touch and Lifelink out of it, which is awesome. Helps against, like, aggro and mid-range. But if you're playing a different spell that's not a burn spell, if it's like an opt or whatever, you can still get a 2/2 that can trade and then shock the opponent's head, right? You only need, 10 2/2s to die, and you close out the game. So I like that this is not relegated to just having to be in a burn deck, because it can get value off of any instant or sorcery, even if it's not a burn spell. But I also like that it gives the versatility if you do happen to have a burn spell, and that you can pick and choose the ability. But like I said, it's super fragile. Maybe in a deck where you're running spells that can protect this at instant speed, like 1 mana, give it hexproof or whatever. Maybe in that scenario, you can make sure it survives a turn cycle. When you protect it, you get a 2/2 red imp. You get some value immediately, and then you untap, and you have access to your burn spells and your ops and your other stuff. And maybe you have another hexproof instant speed spell in your hand so that you can keep holding up protection. And then it really goes off the rails. So it's possible that a deck like that could be pretty wild and that this card could be very useful in a deck like that. But that's really the one scenario where I think this card is actually worth playing for its cost. Because outside of that, you're kind of in a screwed if you do, screwed if you don't. If you play a lot of instants and sorceries, they're always going to have removal for this card because you're not playing enough creatures that are using up their removal, right? But if you don't play enough instants or sorceries, it doesn't matter if this card sticks around because you're not getting a lot of value off of it. You played a 5-drop that was a 3/4, and if it only gets like one of these activations once, that's still not really worth the 5 mana. So, like I said, outside of that, it's kind of screwed if you do, screwed if you don't. But if you're in a very specific deck where your density of instants and sorceries are super high, and some of those instants and sorceries can protect your Judith from the removal that they're bound to still have left over, it's possible. I still think it might be too many hoops to jump through to really make this competitive. But if there's any chance of this card being competitive in Standard, it's going to be in a deck that does that, I think. So keep that in mind. We'll try it eventually for sure. Next up, we've got Kaya Spirit's Justice. This is another card that I think is a lot better than people are giving it credit for. This is a 3 loyalty planeswalker for 1 black, 1 white, and 2. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control and or creature cards in your graveyard are put into exile, you may choose a creature card from among them. Until end of turn, target token you control becomes a copy of it, except it has flying. Let's process this. +2, surveil 2, then exile a card from a graveyard. That seems bad by itself, but in conjunction with the static ability, it's actually really good. If you slam Kaya on a board of tokens that you have, you can immediately +2, surveil 2, put some stuff in the yard, scry into the next card you want, but then also exile a creature so that you can activate the static ability, turn one of the tokens that's already on your board into that creature. So if you brew correctly, this can immediately come down, turn your crappy token into an Atali, or into an Atraxa, or into whatever you want to turn it into, like right away. It's almost like it's a 4 mana reanimation spell in a weird way, except it isn't actually bringing the thing back. It's just turning your token into it. But because your token was already on the field, it doesn't have summoning sickness. So in a way, it's like you're also gaining haste. And it also gains flying, so you have evasion, and it's harder for your opponent to stop it. So it's just, that's a lot. If you're brewing into the right deck to utilize this, like that's an insane turn 4 play, right? And it's a +2, so that brings your loyalty up to 5 when you do it as well, which is kind of gnarly. But then you have these alternate modes as well that fits perfectly into a deck like that. You can +1 to create a 1/1 black and white spirit creature token with flying. So not only is this a way to protect itself the turn it comes down if you're not ready to do the +2 thing, but it also will give you a token so that on a subsequent turn, if you happen to not have a token to use the +2 on or whatever, the static on, now you have a token that you can use that ability on and turn into the biggest threat in the graveyard. So there's synergy there, as well as a way to make a creature token to protect the Kaya, to chump block or whatever. So that's a lot. And then you also have this -2 ability. It's not even an ultimate. You can use this the turn it comes down if you want. -2, exile target creature you control, and for each other player, exile up to 1 target creature that player controls. So you have removal. If you're playing this in a deck that's go wide with tokens, like, it can also be a Rite of Oblivion, a reusable Rite of Oblivion. So, like, it just comes down, and I guess it has to hit a creature, right? Not any permanent, so it's not exactly Rite of Oblivion. But still, the fact that you're using this in a token deck, right? So you're going to have tokens. The fact that this can just come down and you can just get rid of your worst token and get rid of their big threat, use this as removal, and still have the Planeswalker hanging around to be used on subsequent turns. That just seems insane too. You have removal, you have creature generation, you have ridiculous busted win condition thing that you can do without actually having to build up to an ultimate amount of loyalty, like a normal ultimate ability on a planeswalker. That's just so much you can do on one card. And I think the reason people aren't seeing how powerful this card is because they're trying to see it as like, what does it do in a vacuum? What does Kaya do if I just jam it into my Orzhov good stuff deck, right? And it's not going to do enough in those situations. But if it's in the right deck where you're building around that, you know, all of these modes are super useful, it's going to be insane. It's going to be absolutely insane. It's going to come down on 4 and be a reanimation spell with a bunch of upside that leaves behind a planeswalker, that can be a creature token machine, that can be a reusable removal, and like, it's just going to be insane. It's going to be nuts. And I don't think anybody really sees the full potential of this card if it's in the right deck. And then on top of all of that, you also just kind of have protection from exile, right? If you have a big nasty in play, you have a Sheoldred in play or whatever, and your opponent uses ossification on it or whatever, then it immediately allows you to make a token into that, right? So if you're swinging in with like 3 tokens and a big nasty, and like they instant speed try to exile it with a Wandering Emperor, it just turns your other token into the same thing and it's still swinging in. Like, the fact that you get this weird protection against exile stuff like built into a card as just like gravy, as just like extra on top of all the other things it's trying to do, just seems nuts to me. So I'm super excited to brew with this. I think it's way better than people give it credit for. I feel like I've said that a lot about a lot of cards, but I mean, the thing is you have to use it in just the right deck. It's 99 times out of 100, it's not going to be good enough. It's not going to be good enough to just slam into a deck because powerful card is powerful. You have to build around it. But if you do build around it, oh my god, the potential on this card is nuts. Next up, we've got Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy. This is a 3/4 legendary human fairy detective for 1 blue, 1 green, and 2. Has flying and vigilance, and whenever it attacks, you get to destroy up to 1 target artifact. If you controlled that permanent, you draw a card. So before we even get to the adventure side of this, just the creature side is pretty good all by itself. A 3/4 flying vigilance for 4 that has the versatility of being able to, on every attack, either destroy your opponent's worst artifact or destroy one of your own crappier artifacts, a clue token, a blood token, whatever, to just draw a card for free without having to spend mana. Seems really good. That versatility of getting the choice of those two things, as well as the body being super relevant for the cost, it's all pretty good. It's all definitely good enough. It's not like holy crap, but it's like, it's there, man. It's a good card. It is absolutely playable. But then you add to that, you have Tail the Suspect and Adventure. So before you ever play it as Kellen, you can play Tail the Suspect, 1 blue and 1 green for an adventure. You investigate, and you may play an additional land this turn. That's just bananas. So you get a free clue token that can draw you a card later on. So it's like free card advantage, right? And you ramp out a 3rd land. It doesn't come into play tapped, which means you can use that land that turn to play a 1-drop if you want to. I'm assuming you're playing this on turn 2. And then on your next turn, it's turn 3 and you play your 4th land and you just play the Kellen. Like, this is giving me huge Bone Crusher Giant vibes, I guess. Now, granted, the adventure isn't removal, so I don't think it's as crazy as Bone Crusher Giant, but the fact that it curves perfectly from the adventure into the creature, and all of them give you a lot of value, is just kind of nuts. And that clue token it gives you sets you up so that if you want to just draw a card without paying any mana and just hit the clue token with your attack trigger off Kellen, you can. So I just think this is bananas. I don't know exactly what deck wants this. Maybe the ramp deck wants it just because of Tail the Suspect. You know, maybe you play this in the ramp deck and just play an extra land on turn 2, and then Kellen just sits there and doesn't come out until later in the game, and it's just like a free other thing. Maybe, I don't know, but I also feel like there's got to be some other deck out there that includes Simic colors that just wants this curve. Maybe a go wide artifact deck of some form just wants to curve this turn 2 Tail the Suspect, turn 3 Kellen, and then have artifacts lined up to get value off of the Kellen. The card's just powerful. This is a good example of a card that is really good in a vacuum. It's just, it remains to be seen if it's really good or if it's holy crap amazing, right? That's really the X factor there. We don't know if it's one of those two things, but it's at least really good. So play it. I'm going to brew some stuff around it for sure once I figure out just where it fits best. If you have an idea about where it can fit best, let me know in the comments below. Next up, we've got Crawl Whipcracker. 1 green and 1 black for a 3/2 insect assassin with reach. That's already pretty decent. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you can destroy target token and opponent controls. So just some extra value there tacked on. This card is really good. It's also worth noting it's an assassin. So this is a good example of a card that can slot into the assassin tribal deck as a 2-drop and be super worth it, I think. Yeah, I think this card is really good. I'm excited to potentially use it in Assassin Tribal. I don't know if it's going to make the cut as, you know, one of the 2-drop assassins in the deck at the end of the day, but it's definitely up for contention. In Limited, this guy is just nuts. Like, slam him all day. He's a super aggressive 2-drop that can also double as a thing that can kill their 3 toughness flyer by blocking it later on in the game if you're not winning the race. And it's just got extra value tacked on that can kill tokens. Like, it's just all around a good card. Like, if you're in Golgari, take this high, run it, especially if you're in an aggro deck where you can make use of the 3 power on turn 2. Just run the thing. It's super good. Next up, we've got Kylox's Volt Strider. 1 red, 1 blue, and 1 for a 4/4 artifact vehicle with Collect Evidence 6. An ability where you can collect evidence 6 and activate the ability, and it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. It can also crew for 2. So you have the option here of turning it into a 4/4 creature by crewing it with 2 powers worth of creatures being tapped, or crewing it without having to tap any creatures and just collecting evidence 6. So that versatility is pretty cool. Whenever it attacks, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from among cards exiled with it. If that spell would be put into a graveyard, you put it into the bottom of its owner's library instead. There's a lot here. First of all, I heard people online being bummed because when they first read this card, they thought they got to cast the spell for free. And then when they found out, like, no, you get to cast it, but you still have to pay for it. They were like, oh, it's not good anymore. But I disagree. I think casting it for free would just be broken, and having to pay the mana cost, it's still super, super good. Like, you collect evidence once, and not only do you not have to crew it with creatures the first time you attack, because you collected evidence, but you get to pull out these instants or sorceries that you get to recast, and immediately cast one that turn on the attack. So you're attacking kind of for free without having to crew this that turn, and pulling out instants and sorceries to use for the next few turns, right? And then casting whichever one you have the mana left over to actually play that turn. But then on subsequent turns, you've still got a couple cards exiled with this, which means you can just crew with a creature now, tap a 2-power creature or 2 1/1s or whatever, swing with this, and cast another one of the exiled cards. And you don't have to collect evidence 6 again until you run out of things to cast with it. Or if you want to, if you don't have any creatures, if your opponent wipes the board and you don't have a way to crew this, you can at least just collect evidence 6 again and use it as an alternate way to crew the thing, and then still get some more instants and sorceries exiled that you can cast later on in the process. So I think the versatility of not only being able to exile things to cast and getting to recast these cards on attacks, but also having alternate ways to crew this thing when you don't have creatures to maybe respond to a sweeper or whatever, it's just a lot. It's a lot packed into one card. That's a 4/4 that ends up only costing you 3 mana to play initially. So this is another one of those cards that I just think it's way better than people are giving it credit for. Obviously, you want to be in a deck that's using a ton of instants and sorceries so that you can constantly get value off of it. But that deck's going to exist, and this card should absolutely be used in it. So do the thing. Next up, we've got KARLOV's Visionary Inventor. This is 1 red, 1 blue, and 5 for a 4/4 Menace Haste Legendary Viashino Artificer with Ward 2. That's a lot. Whenever he attacks, you sack any number of other creatures and then exile the top X cards of your library, where X is their total power, and then you may cast any number of instant or sorcery spells from among the exiled cards without paying their mana cost. Alright, so it's not a super good body by itself, but it's hard to remove because of the ward, and it's hard to block because of the menace, so it's somewhat safe to swing in with the haste. That's worth noting. Now, 7 mana is a lot. By the time you can hard cast this, I don't know if you're going to get enough value off of it to be worth it. You might even be just dead by the time you can hard cast it. So you do want to find a way to cheat this into play. It's also worth noting that even though you can sacrifice multiple creatures, you're exiling a number of cards equal to the total power. So you're actually going to get value off of playing very high mana cost, high power creatures, because every one creature that you sacrifice is going to get a lot of hits from the top of your library, and all of those hits, if they are really expensive instants or sorceries, you can play them for free. It doesn't matter what the mana cost is. So this is going to work best in a deck that can cheat it out, that has very expensive instants and sorceries, that has creatures with very high power, so that you don't have to sacrifice as many to get the value. All of that, to me, screams Reanimator. If you play this in a Reanimator deck, you can reanimate the KARLOVs, have it immediately swing in, sacrifice another creature that you had reanimated prior with huge power, maybe a Ghalta because of 12 or whatever, and then just exile the top 12 cards and play all of your reanimation spells that are instants or sorceries, plus any other instants or sorceries you happen to have in the deck. Just play them all for free, and maybe reanimate a few more things for free, and just kind of go to town. So it is possible this guy sees play in some kind of a weird reanimator spell where it just kind of comes out of nowhere and just goes way over the top with value and gets a ton of things back. Can play a Breach the Multiverse for free, can do all sorts of shenanigans like that. So there's something here. There's a deck here that this wants to be in for sure. But because this is so expensive and such a small body, I think it very specifically needs to be in that deck or it's not worth it. And I don't know exactly what that deck looks like yet, but eventually we'll get around to trying to brew something with this guy, and we'll see if we can make all of that pan out. But the idea is there. The concept, I think, of how this guy is used best is there, just waiting to be explored. So eventually we'll get around to it, and it'll be interesting to see if we can make it work. Next up, we've got Lazav, Wearer of Faces. This is one of my favorite cards in the set. This is a 2/3 legendary Shapeshifter Detective. So he counts as a detective, which is kind of cool. For just 2 mana, 1 black and 1 blue. Whenever Wearer of Faces attacks, you get to exile a card from a graveyard and then investigate. And whenever you sacrifice a clue, you may have Lazav become a copy of a creature card exiled with it until end of turn. Now, what's important to note here is whenever you sack a clue and turn Lazav into a copy of a creature card exiled with it until end of turn, you don't have to turn it into a copy of the thing that you exiled that turn. Once you swing with this once and exile 1 card from a graveyard, for the rest of the game, every time you sack a clue, you can have Lazav become that thing until end of turn. So as long as you have a steady supply of clue tokens, you can just make Lazav become that same thing you exiled the first time it attacked over and over and over and over. And since he gives you a free clue token every time he swings, he gives you the clue that you need to do that. So, like, if you can just somehow mill something nasty into your graveyard by turn 3, play this on 2, turn 3, get, like, I don't know, an Atraxa into the graveyard or something, all you have to do is sacrifice the clue that you make, if you have the 2 mana left over to do that, and it's an Atraxa. And it it swings in as an Atraxa. And then every turn after that, it swings, gives you a clue, you sack the clue, turn it into Atraxa. And then you just win, unless they remove it. But then you could always, like, maybe set it up so that the first creature you exile is, like, a creature with hexproof, or a creature with a really nasty ward condition, or something like that, so that, like, that's an option to turn into, and then they have a hard time removing it. And then maybe you can get to a point where other cards that you're playing are building up extra clue tokens, and you can do some weird stuff where, like, you turn it into an Atraxa, and then they try to kill it, and you crack another clue, and in response you turn it into your hexproof creature, so then the thing fizzles, and then after the thing fizzles, then you crack another clue to turn it back into Atraxa. Like, there's a lot of shenanigans you can do, but just at the floor, being able to just, like, oh, this is swinging as, like, this big, giant, insane creature on turn 3, and it's just going to do that every turn now. Like, that's bananas. And it's also worth noting, if you're paying the 2 mana to sack these clue tokens, you're also drawing a card every turn. You're not drawing the card from the clue token when you do this. So, that's kind of bananas. And then also, if you find ways to include cards in the deck that can sacrifice those clue tokens without having to pay the 2, that's even more value. If you're able to sack clue tokens for free, maybe you've got, like, Bartolome or something on the board, and you're able to play cards that give you a bunch of extra clue tokens, and now you can sack clue tokens for free. You have the ability to, like, not even have to pay mana, and you can still turn it into the thing with hexproof, or turn it into the Atraxa, or whatever. So it's just kind of nutty. The more you attack with it, the more things you exile with it, the more options you have of what you can turn it into every single turn whenever you crack that clue. And it's giving you the clue every turn to do it. So I just think this card is nutty. I don't know why more people aren't talking about it. I think swinging as, like, the bombiest possible creature in the format every single turn, without having to have any hoops to jump through other than just getting something into your yard, just seems bananas to me. And you still get card advantage from the clues. I don't know. It just seems nuts. Like, we're going to brew with this. It's going to be bananas. Play the damn card, because it's going to do gross things. You're going to see. Next up, we've got one of my favorite cards in the set, Leyline of the Guild Pact. Most people who have seen this card so far think it's a very much ho-hum, do-nothing card that looks flashy and you want to be excited about, but it just doesn't do enough, so it's just going to be a trap, is what most people are thinking. But I've personally challenged myself to find ways to take this card over the top, in Standard specifically, and really make it work well, and I think I have come up with 2 really good deck ideas to do that with. So let's talk about the card first. This is a 4 mana enchantment that is a hybrid mana of each of the different green hybrid mana symbols. So green white, green blue, green black, green red. So you can play this in mono green.
Coffee break.
Coffee break.
Coffee break. Coffee. Nectar of the gods.
So the best part of Leyline of the Guild Pact is the best part of any Leyline, which is if it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield, which is actually pretty nuts. Now, this is a little bit better than most Leylines when you take into account the fact that it's got 4 pips in its mana cost, so anything with Devotion is going to get a bunch of free Devotion, especially if you're going for Devotion to green, since each of the pips counts as a green mana pip. That's 4 Devotion for green, starting on the battlefield, basically turn 0, which can be pretty nuts. The other abilities here, each non-land permanent you control is all colors, and lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. Now, I think the trick to making this card work well is to get a lot of value off of those abilities, but at the same time not be reliant on it, because you're not always going to be able to start the game with this on the battlefield. It's not always going to be in your opening hand. So if you build too heavily around all of the value you get off of when that happens, your deck's going to be super underpowered and kind of meh when it doesn't happen. And I think that's why a lot of people are looking at this card and going, well, it just doesn't do enough. I don't think it's worth it, right? But it's worth noting that, like, lands being every basic land type, that's going to turn on domain for you. It's also going to turn on things that care about a specific land type, like Flourishing Bloomkin that we saw in the green set review. That is, you know, +1/+1 for each forest you control. Doesn't matter what lands you're playing, they're all going to count as forests and make that bigger. And then each non-land permanent you control as all colors is going to matter for things that care about that. So it's like, how do we get the most value out of these abilities without them being completely useless if we just draw a Leyline of the Guild Pact later in the game? So I think there are two key ways to use this in Standard that makes it good. The first one is using it in a domain style deck with some of the Gruul creatures that get value off of that, which we'll absolutely be doing. Neshoba Brawler, stuff like that, as well as like Flourishing Bloomkin, like being able to put a creature in the deck that gets bigger off of every forest, while also putting a creature in the same deck that gets bigger off of different land types, and having them both get the maximum value because of Leyline of the Guild Pact is kind of awesome. And there's definitely some other ways that deck can utilize this card that I don't want to get into too much right now. We'll wait until I come out with my 10 new brews deck, a 10 new brews video showcasing which brews I'm looking to make, and you guys can vote on that video and decide which order I make those brews in. But I think the other cool way to use Leyline of the Guild Pact is to ask ourselves, like, what value does a 4-mana enchantment hold in these two scenarios? One, just starting the battlefield on the battlefield as a 4-mana enchantment, even if the other abilities don't matter at all, just starting on the battlefield for free and it being a 4-mana enchantment, how can that matter? And also, if we get this later in the game, and it doesn't matter if everything's every color or everything's every basic land type, how do we get value off of a 4-mana enchantment that we play that does nothing? And my answers to both of those, I've got two very relevant ones. The first one is Zur. If we start with a free 4-drop enchantment on the battlefield, that's an extra 4/4 creature to turn into a creature with Zur later on, that will also have Hexproof and Death Touch and Lifelink and all that good stuff. So that's some extra value we can get off this card. And we can also get that value if we draw into one later in the game, when normally we'd be bummed to see one, right? At least it's not useless. We can play it for 4 mana and turn it into a creature with Zur. So that's some extra value we can get off this a little bit later in the game. And then there's also Hallowed Haunting, where even if we end up drawing into one of these cards later in the game, it's not going to be completely useless sitting in our hand and we have nothing to do. It's just a waste of 4 mana. Instead, we can at least play it as an enchantment and trigger the Hallowed Haunting and get a spirit token. So I think there are ways to get more value off this under the surface that aren't obvious or apparent right away. And I've got two specific brews that I'm going to be working on in two completely different ways that are going to do that. So I'm excited to try this in Standard, and I'm really hoping that we can brew something that is a surprise and take all these people that think this card is just unplayable in Standard and maybe spin around 180 degrees and make them realize, like, oh wait, there are actually some decks that this can be used in that are contenders for sure. So I'm excited to see if we can make that work and get there. I think this card is pretty cool. Obviously in older formats it's going to be nuts, because starting with 4 green pips of Devotion for something like a Nykthos is going to be insane. But I think Standard is really where it's being overlooked the most, and I'm excited to just try and build the best possible deck that can take the most advantage of this card as possible, so that we can actually see, like, is it worth it or not? It's going to be interesting. Next up, we've got Lightning Helix, a reprint, 1 white, 1 red for an instant, deals 3 damage to target, any target, and you gain 3 life. The versatility of being able to use this as creature removal or to finish off an opponent while also padding out your life total so that you can race. It's always been a great card at instant speed. This is going to be a very high pick, and it's probably one of the better uncommons in the set. Definitely grab this for your limited deck, and it's absolutely going to make a splash in Constructed. I'm expecting to see Boros Burn or Boros Aggro with this as part of its removal suite pop up a lot more prevalently than Mono Red has been lately. So Very interesting that this is back in standard, and I'm excited to see where it goes. Next up, we have Meddling Youths. 1 white, 1 red, and 3 for a 4/5 human detective with haste. And whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you get to investigate. This is a little expensive. But as far as maybe just a one-off at the top end of, you know, an aggressive Boros deck, because by that time you're kind of running out of gas, and the ability to get a clue token every single turn, including the turn that you play this because of the haste, is actually decent, right? It is still a 5 mana thing that's only 4 power, so I don't recommend going more than one of these in your deck, but you could do a lot worse as far as your top end, your most expensive thing in the deck for a Boros aggressive deck. So in limited, consider this as a one-of at the top end for sure. I wouldn't take it too high though, but like I said, it shores up kind of like what the deck is missing and gives you some legs in being able to give you these clue tokens turn after turn. Next up, we've got Melik, Reforged Researcher. This is one of the pre-release cards, so in physical cards, you can only get this in a pre-release pack, and you could probably get it in a collector's pack as well. But the only confirmed way is in the pre-release pack. This is 1 red, 1 blue, and 3 for a legendary weird detective, and Melik Reforged Researcher's power and toughness are equal to twice the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. So it's like a super haughty djinn. And the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs 3 less to cast, which is also kind of like a super haughty djinn. So it doesn't have the flying, but it gets a lot bigger, a lot quicker. And the kind of instants and sorceries you want to be playing shifts with a card like this, because you want to be playing 1 instant or sorcery a turn that is expensive and has at least 3 colorless in the cost, rather than with Haughty Djinn playing as many as possible. But at the same time, you do want to fill up your graveyard with a bunch, because it is going to make this guy super big, super quick. So I think the best way to use this is with some of those 4-drop spells that you discard a card, draw 2, create 2 treasures. I think that's really, really powerful, because you can play that for just 1 mana and discard another instant or sorcery into your graveyard, so that this thing essentially gets +4/+4 forever by casting one of those spells for just 1 mana, and then you also draw 2 and make 2 treasures, so that you can like maybe play something else that turn too. So that seems really powerful. I think in just the right kind of deck, this guy might be really good, but at the same time, it is a 5 mana thing that does nothing the turn it comes into play. So I think at the end of the day, Haughty Djinn is still going to be better. I think this card's going to be a little bit of a meme, but there definitely are ways to use it and get a ton of value off of it. So it could crop up here or there, but like I said, I do expect it to mostly be a little too cute, too many hoops to jump through for 5 whole mana. So most of the time, it's just going to die to removal the turn you play it, and that's going to feel bad. I think it's pretty fringe, but it is possible. Next up, we've got Niv Mizzet Guild Pact. This is my biggest disappointment in the whole set. A 6/6 flying hexproof from multicolored legendary dragon avatar for WUBRG. 1 mana of each color. So that's 5 total. And that sounds pretty good at first, but 5 mana is a lot. And hexproof from multicolor isn't as good as you'd think it would be, because most of the best removal spells are monocolor removal spells, and they can just all hit this. And because it's just hexproof from multicolor, it's not protection from multicolor, it's not affected at all. It's not effective at all against, you know, creatures on the ground that are multicolor. So it's the hexproof from multicolor is a lot more limited than you might think, and it's not as good as it seems when you first see it and go, oh my god, hexproof from multicolor, right? So 6/6 flying hexproof from multicolor for 5, it's okay, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through if it's just that. The one part that could make this card a lot better is its main ability here. Whenever Niv Mizzet deals combat damage to a player, it deals X damage to any target, and target player draws X cards, and you gain X life, where X is the number of different color pairs among permanents you control that are exactly 2 colors. So the problem with this is you have to be playing a lot of permanents, and all of those permanents have to be as evenly split up among as many different guilds as possible in order to grow what X can be as a number for this. So there's a lot of hoops to jump through to make it work. And for a card that only has hexproof from multicolor, that's really easy to get rid of with monocolor removal the turn you play it. That's a lot of hoops to build around, just to have your creature die to removal the turn you play it, and then have a less than average deck left over because the whole reason you brewed the rest of your deck around these guilds is this card. And now you're just playing a less powerful deck that jumped through hoops for nothing, which seems kind of bad. Also, as a 6/6 flyer, with this ability only triggering when you deal combat damage to a player, like if you're already able to connect with a player and deal 6 in the air and combat damage, like you're probably almost killing them already as it is. They've got a very low clock until they're dead, so like getting extra value in that scenario seems a little bit win more. So because of both of those circumstances, I don't think this card is as good as people want it to be, or as good as first impressions might imply. That being said, it is possible we see a 5-color legendary deck that includes something like Joda really make kind of like a comeback and a splash. And if a card like this can be included in a deck like that, without having to jump through hoops, if the deck's already good and already mostly built in a way that Niv Mizzet can get a lot of value off of what the deck's already doing, without having to like change the deck and lessen the power of the deck in order to include a bunch of guilds, then it is possible that this card could still be really good in a deck like that, just as another thing you can include, as long as you're not building around it too much. Very, very specific deck it would have to be to make it work. But if you do pull it off, another 5-mana thing alongside Joda that can get you a ton of value in the late game could be really good in that deck. So it'll be interesting to see if it's actually good enough in a deck like that. But outside of that deck, if you're just specifically trying to build around Niv Mizzet, I just don't think it's worth it. I just don't think it's good enough. Next up, we've got No More Lies. I want to be a lot more excited about this card than I actually am, and there's a good reason for that. This is 1 blue and 1 white for an instant, so 2 mana. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. If that spell is countered this way, you exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. So it's a mana leak for the same amount of mana, even though it has more hoops to jump through as far as the colors you have to pay. But it has strict upside in that it exiles the thing that it counters instead of putting it in the graveyard. So it's just a mana leak that exiles. Under normal circumstances, I would think this card is absolutely nuts. Probably the best counterspell we've gotten in a long time. The problem is this is coming off the heels of a set that just gave us back Cavern of Souls, which is making all of our tribal decks be able to play our creatures without being able to be countered, right? So counter spells right now as a whole are at an all-time low for how powerful they are, for how relevant they are, and for how playable they are. So for this counterspell in particular to come into standard rotation at a time when counterspells as a whole aren't super good is just kind of a bummer. It's really kind of a bummer. And since the two sets where both of those things came out in are one after another, for basically the entire time that one is in standard, the other one will be in standard. Part of me wonders if they planned this intentionally so that you have like a not as powerful as it could have been counterspell for standard, but then for older formats you have a strict upgrade of mana leak for decks that are in blue-white, and that is possible. This is still a powerful card no matter how you slice it, but like I said, with Cavern of Souls kicking around, like it's not what it otherwise would have been. If that card wasn't in standard, this card would have been bananas and blue-white control would have been taking over. But since we have Cavern of Souls, I guess it allows for a card that's as powerful as this to exist and not completely warp the format. So it could just be a balancing thing. Either way, absolutely great card. It's going to be awesome and limited if you're in the right colors. So pick it up, I think. But just a strict upgrade on Mana Leak, which is really nice. Next up, we have Officious Interrogation. This is another one that people seem lukewarm on, and I just think it's really good. 1 blue and 1 white for an instant. It costs 1 extra blue and white mana to cast for each target beyond the first. You choose any number of target players, and then you investigate X times, where X is the total number of creatures those players control. So I think people are seeing this and thinking, oh, it's just a commander card, right? And obviously it's going to be better in commander, because for every 2 mana you spend, you get to pick another player. And then for all the players you pick, you get to make a whole bunch of clue tokens and go super wide with clues, right? But even just in standard, like being able to cast this for 2 mana at instant speed and choose whichever player, either you or your opponent, who has the most creatures, just gives you that many clue tokens. Seems like you could go pretty wide with clue tokens for just 2 mana, and you do it at instant speed, which means you don't need to give up the ability to hold up instant speed removal, counter spells, or whatever. And then if you don't need to cast those things, you can just cast this and get a whole bunch of clue tokens. And then you can just hold up the clue tokens and still hold up those same counter spells and pieces of removal. And whatever mana you have left over at the end of each of your opponent's turns, you can start to crack those clue tokens and draw cards. So I think it's pretty good, and the fact that you can pay 4 mana to just get clue tokens for how many creatures are in play on both sides is also a nice little bit of gravy that's going to work out in some scenarios. But I think where this card is going to work out best, and that people are overlooking, is not necessarily needing those clue tokens to be clue tokens in order for them to be valuable, not needing to crack them for 2 mana, and instead playing this in a deck that's going super wide with artifact synergies that can get value off of going wide with artifacts. If you're able to make 6, 7, 8 artifacts in 1 turn for just 2 mana, and that's going to trigger your Teething Wormlets, or make your Machiko's Reign of Truth hit insanely high, or just give you endless sacrifice fodder for your Oni-Cult Anvil or whatever, I think that can be a lot of value. And then maybe you're cracking some of those clue tokens to actually draw cards along the way as well, and that's just even more value. Like, for just 2 mana at instant speed, I just think this has a ton of potential if it's used in the right deck. It's another one where you definitely want to use it in the right deck. I don't think you just use it as your card draw thing in your control deck, and just if they have creatures, you get a bunch of clue tokens. I don't necessarily think it quite makes the cut, although maybe if we were in a 2-year rotation, it would actually be good enough to be your card draw spell of choice in blue-white control for standard right now. But we have so many good cards, we have such high card quality because of the bigger card pool, that I don't think this card just is a slam dunk in a deck in that way. But I think if your deck really can make use of these artifacts in other ways, I think this card could be really good in it. So don't count it out at first. Keep it in mind for artifact decks, because I do think it could be a sleeper that really goes the distance. Next up, we've got Private Eye. This is a 3/3 Homunculus Detective for 1 blue, 1 white, and 1. And it's a Lord. It gives other detectives you control +1/+1, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, target detective can't be blocked this turn. This is another one that's a little bit better than it looks. Granted, it's a Lord that costs a whopping 3 mana. Lords that cost 2 are obviously a lot better. And you get that buff across the board to your detectives. But if you are going wide into the detective theme and are also going wide into the clue theme, which it does seem like both of those archetypes kind of overlap a bit, this can be super good, because all you have to do is crack 1 clue on your turn, and you get to make your best detective unblockable. And that best detective is doing an extra point of damage as well because of the buff that Private Eye is giving. And then the other detectives can always just hang back and be blockers if you need. So yeah, if you can go wide enough with clues, it's nice that this can just trigger off just sacking 1 clue during your main phase. But you get the buff no matter what. So both sides of the equation, it is delivering, and I do think that makes it worth the 3 mana, especially because it's also a 3/3 body, so it's somewhat on rate as far as just the body. So if you're deep enough into detectives, I think you want to play this, especially in limited. And if you can go somewhat deep into clues as well, it can just be really good. If you're super deep into both, I think this card is just a slam dunk, and you want to try to take it high. But it is possible there's a detective archetype in standard. I think the chances are unlikely that it's quite good enough for standard, but if there is a detective deck that does make the cut, that does end up being good enough for standard, I wouldn't be surprised if Private Eye is a part of that, because unblockability for just a couple turns in a row on your best creature could just close out the game for you. Next up, we've got another split card. This might be the best one. This is Push and Pull. So on the push side, you have a sorcery for 1 Orzhov hybrid mana and 1, so a total of 2. Destroy target tapped creature. This is great as removal that you can just play as early as turn 2, just destroy their best attacker that swung in at you the last turn, right? Because of that, I think this card is super good in general. Any of these split cards that have a removal option as one of the sides is just going to be really, really good and very usable, because the cost of inclusion is just so low, right? The opportunity cost is so low if one of the sides is removal, like it is here. The other side is pull, 2 Rakdos mana and 4, so total of 6 for a sorcery, and you put up to 2 target creature cards from a single graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. They gain haste until end of turn, but then you have to sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. So not only do you have a piece of removal here that's decently costed, but you also have a end the game bomb that can just take the 2 best creatures out of a graveyard, whether it's your opponent's or your own, just slam them onto the battlefield and smash your opponent in the face with them and probably close out the game. And then even if they don't close out the game, if you have some sacrifice synergies, you get free sacrifice fodder to sacrifice to your sacrifice effects as well, which is kind of nice since those creatures are just gonna, be sacrificed anyway at the end of turn. So I just think this card is really good. Like, pull is just gonna be a win condition in a lot of scenarios if you can just get to that 6 mana, especially if you're in a deck with a lot of removal where you've been able to remove some of their best creatures along the course of the game, and now those same creatures that they would have won the game with, you just bring them back and alpha strike them for the win. So I think both sides of this are a complete win, and I do think it's probably the best split card we've seen. Again, keep in mind, total of 8 mana value here for Collect Evidence, so a very, very high pick for Collect Evidence decks. Next up, we've got Rakdos, Patron of Chaos. I think I'm the only one who thinks this guy is insane, but he is. 6/6 flying, trample, legendary demon for 1 red, 1 black, and 4. Granted, 6 mana is a lot, but his ability is nuts. At the beginning of your end step, target opponent may sacrifice 2 non-land, non-token permanents. If they don't, you draw 2 cards. So this is like a mini Invoke Despair on a stick, and we all know how good Invoke Despair was, except this is way more splashable because it only requires 1 black and 1 red in the mana cost, so it's a lot easier to put this in more decks. You don't have to get to a high threshold of black mana like you did with Invoke Despair, and you just get to trigger it at the end of every single one of your turns. Now, what's important to note here is it triggers at the end of your turn, not like during your upkeep or whatever, which means as long as you play it on a turn where your opponent's tapped out, or on a turn that has, where they just don't have instant speed removal, maybe they've only got sorcery speed removal, you're going to definitely get a trigger at the end of your turn, and they're going to have to sacrifice 2 relevant permanents. They can't sacrifice tokens or let you draw 2 cards. So in that scenario, as long as you can set up the board state properly and play this properly in a situation where they're not going to respond with instant speed removal and blow you out, it's automatically a 3-for-1, right? You have a creature they have to deal with, you've gotten rid of 2 relevant permanents or drawn 2 cards, automatic 3-for-1. But the fact that if they don't deal with it, you then go on to get this 2 card advantage every single turn, this mini Invoke Despair every single turn, where every turn they have to sack 2 relevant non-token permanents or let you draw 2 cards at the end of your turn before they get the opportunity to draw that piece of removal or use that piece of sorcery speed removal in their hand. If this just sticks around, you just win. And I think it's really, really good. It reminds me of why 𝑒𝐀𝐕𝐈𝐎𝐑 is so good, even though when that card was being spoiled, everyone was like, well, it's a 4-mana creature that doesn't do anything when it comes into play. So, it's just going to die to removal that costs less than 4, and it's just not going to be good enough, right? There was a lot of that sentiment going around when 𝑒𝐀𝐕𝐈𝐿D was first spoiled, but now it's like the most important staple in Standard. It's everywhere because of a simple reason that if it sticks around, it just wins the game by itself, right? And it's also tends to be used in decks where you're putting pressure on the board constantly and your opponent can't just let it slide and has to use their removal targeting things prior to the turn it comes into play. So by the time you play your Sheoldred on turn 4, your opponent might be out of removal. I think this guy is going to be really good in a similar way, where if he just sticks around and your opponent can't deal with them, they're just dead, right? So as long as you play him in a deck where you run your opponent out of removal with relevant threats earlier in the game, so that the chances of this guy sticking when you play him are super high, I think he's going to be amazing. And even if you don't manage to run your opponent out of removal, if you're just careful and make sure they're tapped out when you play it, you're at least getting the 1 trigger, which means it's an automatic 3-for-1. So on either side of that coin, I think this guy is going to be really good, and I'm excited to use him at the top end of just an incredibly powerful Jund deck, Jund good stuff deck, where like every single card you play is just a hugely relevant threat that has to be dealt with one-on-one. You could put Glissa in there, you could put Sheoldred in there, you could put Bonehorde Dracosaur in there, and like anything, once they run out of removal, if one of those creatures sticks, you just take over the game and win. And I think Rakdos is a really good option to have at the top end of a deck like that. Just like, they're probably out of removal, you've played too many must answer threats, you slam it, it sticks, and you just take over the game. So I think this guy is bananas. Has to be used in just the right deck. Obviously, if you're creature light, they're always going to have removal for him, and you're not going to get the value. But if you play it carefully and you build your decks carefully, I think he's just an insane powerhouse. Next up, we've got Rakish Scoundrel, a 3/3 elf rogue with Death Touch for 1 green, 1 black, and 2. That's not nothing. And when he enters the battlefield or is turned face up, target creature gains indestructible until end of turn. So this is a pretty decent 4-drop. Just a 3/3 Death Touch that gives your biggest attacker the ability to swing in without being killed is fine on its own. But the fact that you can kind of trick him out, play him earlier as a 2/2 ward 2 for 3, and then just flip him up when your opponent doesn't see it coming. Not only when you pay this guy's disguise cost and flip him, do you get to give one of your creatures indestructible that otherwise would have died in combat as a combat trick. But this thing itself can also be swinging in and then surprise the opponent by being a Death Touch creature, right? By killing whatever they block it with, no matter what it is, and possibly even surviving, since it becomes a 3/3 instead of the 2/2 it was before it got flipped up. So there's a lot of potential here in tricks as far as in combat, and there's a versatility in how you can play it, just like all of the disguised creatures, and it doesn't have to be in Golgari, right? It can be in mono black, mono green, or any deck that uses one of those colors as its primary color, or as a primary color. Very easy to include this, and I just think it's a really good card. For a common, it's kind of nutty. A lot of these common disguise cards are way better than they look on the surface. Next up, we have Relive the Past. 1 white, 1 green, and 5 for a sorcery. Return up to 1 target artifact card, 1 target land card, and 1 target non-aura enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. They are 5/5 elemental creature types in addition, elemental creatures in addition to their other types. This card's another one that's kind of bonkers if it's in the right deck. So the most important thing to not lose sight of with this card is you're getting 3 5/5s, right? It's 7 mana, sure, but you're getting 3 5/5s as well as bringing your most expensive artifact and enchantment and a random land as well back from the graveyard onto the battlefield. And that definitely makes it worth the cost. But if we can make this thing cheaper, that's where it really starts to shine. And going back to a deck I was talking about earlier in this video, the Hinata deck that was using Doppelganger, this card slots perfectly into that. Because this has 3 targets, it gets a 3 mana cost reduction from Hinata, which means it only costs a total of 4 mana to bring your best artifact, best land, best enchantment back from the graveyard and get 3 5/5s for 4 mana. That's insane. That works super well with Hinata. It also gets the cost reduction from the artifact we were talking about before that gets an oil counter every turn and makes things cost less, so there's extra synergy built in there. And it can set you up with more things on the field to copy with Doppelgang when you play Doppelgang. So in just every possible way, I feel like it synergizes with everything that deck wants to do. So we definitely need to brew this. Like, it needs to be a thing. We're going to do it. I think it's super cool. If you're not having some way to reduce the cost of this, it's just a really overcosted reanimation spell. And even though it does get you 3 different things back, and it does give you a total of 15 power and toughness, like, you're not getting them into play quicker, you're just getting more things, because the 7 cost is what you would normally pay for your most expensive artifacts or enchantments, right? So it's not really cheating anything into play sooner if you play this fair, and that makes the card not quite as good. So I think you do need to find a way to reduce the cost of this, or to play it for free with like Hideaway, with like Fight Rigging or something like that, in order to get the most value out of this card and to make it worth running. But if you can find a way to do that, it's just kind of insane. So let's build that. Next up, we've got Repulsive Mutation. 1 blue, 1 green, and X. For an instant, you put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, and then counter up to 1 target spell unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. This card's also a lot better than it looks. Now, ignore the X for now. The most important thing to keep in mind is that X is extra, right? And at its base, you can just pay 2 mana to counter something unless its controller pays mana equal to the highest power among creatures you control. So if you're in a decent creature-based deck that's running Simic colors, you can just include this as your counterspell, and it's going to be pretty good. But the fact that your counterspell has the upside of being able to dump however much mana into it you want to put a whole bunch of counters on one of your creatures and make it huge, and then have the versatility of being able to increase the amount of mana that your opponent has to pay in order for its thing to not be countered, like all of that as an extra is just kind of nuts. As a 2 mana instant at the uncommon level, this card is just really good. And even when you might be normally hesitant to run counterspells in a deck, maybe your deck isn't playing in that way, in that style where it can use a counterspell, this is actually worth considering including just for putting a bunch of counters on a creature, you know, if you're in limited. So the fact that your spell that can put a bunch of counters on a creature in limited can also potentially counterspell something in the right scenario is also pretty good. So I think this guy is just a slam dunk all around if you're in a deck that can make use of it. So I recommend it. Next up, we've got Riftburst Hellion. This is a 6/7 Hellion with reach for 1 green, 1 red, and 5. That's a lot of mana. 7 for a 6/7 reach is a bit much. The most important thing to note about this is it does count as 7 in your graveyard for Collect Evidence. So if you're in the Collect Evidence deck and you're surveilling, this could be a really good inclusion as a way that if you come across it earlier in the game, just dump it into the graveyard and use it as huge Collect Evidence fodder. But if you get it early, you can just play it disguised, 3 mana for a 2/2 Ward 2, and then at some point later in the game, when you do happen to get to 6 mana, you just flip it up into a 6/7 reach, probably while blocking, and blow out your opponent and kill their best thing, and then like have this huge threat on the board, which is really nice. And again, it's one of those common disguise creatures that doesn't have to be in Gruul. It can be in a deck that's just base red or base green and any color combination, and you can still make the disguise work. So pretty cool card. Next up, we've got Runebrand Juggler, a 2/2 human shaman for 1 red and 1 black. When he enters the battlefield, you get to suspect up to 1 target creature you control, and then you can pay 5 mana and sack a suspected creature and give target creature -5/-5 until end of turn. So obviously, if you're in like a suspected archetype where you're doing a lot of suspecting, maybe you're trying to give all of your creatures menace so that you can race your opponent, and like that's the archetype of your limited deck, this is going to be really good because all of your suspected creatures just become potential removal. And even though 5 mana is a lot for a reusable removal ability in a limited deck, it's fine. It's good because you're playing the card for cheaper than that and able to use it at least as a creature while you're waiting to get up to that 5 mana. So in Suspected Tribal, this guy is going to be kind of nuts because all of your creatures just become potential removal, right? You can swing in with all of them with Menace, get through with a bunch of creatures, make it hard for them to block, but then like at instant speed, you can sack one to like kill their best creature so that they can't crack back at you, or, you know, after combat do that, or in combat you can do it to like kill one of their big creatures that's blocking something that's like a 6/6 or a 7/7, and now they're gonna die, and the threat of activation is there. So there's a lot of like little ways that you can get value off this ability, and the fact that you're able to give a creature you control the suspected status when he enters the battlefield actually makes him usable even outside of that archetype. So even just as a creature that you're running as a 2-drop in your Rakdos deck in Limited, you know, the ability to like just come into play as a 2/2 menace that can't block if you're in an aggressive deck, that can then later on, if you happen to have enough mana and he's still around, just sacrifice himself to give something -5/-5. Even that as the floor is honestly pretty good. As long as, you know, that suspected status that's giving the menace isn't going to be a detriment because you can't block. So you do need to make sure you're in the kind of deck that is being aggressive and wanting to race your opponent if you're going to play this. But in that deck or in Suspected Tribal, like, this is just going to be a slam dunk. This is going to be a very high pick, so make sure you grab it if that's what you're looking to do in Limited. Next up, we've got Sanguine Savior. These common disguise creatures are just knocking it out of the park. 2/1 Vampire Cleric with flying and lifelink for 1 black, 1 white, and 1. That alone is pretty good. A 2/1 flying lifelink, like, chances are they're not going to be able to block it. It's swinging the game for 4 points of life every turn because you're gaining 2, they're losing 2, and, you know, it's putting you on a much larger clock and putting your opponent on a smaller clock, and it's just, lifelink's just really good in Limited. Flying is really good in Limited. Both of them on the same creature is going to be really, really good in Limited. So the fact that that creature is somewhat decently costed at only being a 3-drop and having more than just 1 power is super important. But it doesn't stop there. You can disguise this guy. When it's turned face up, another target creature you control gets lifelink, which helps you win the race even more, and it flips up for just 2 mana, hybrid mana of Orzhov. So you don't even have to play it in Orzhov. You can play it in anything that's using a lot of white or a lot of black and maybe some other colors. So it's just all around a really good card that's going to help you race and win games, like kind of all by itself, with extra versatility added into it. Even if you don't have the right color mana, you can just play it as a 2/2 ward 2. So like, it's just good. It's just good in every way. This might even be the best common disguise creature, to be honest. Definitely slam it. Slam it if you're playing in white or black. Next up, we've got Shady Informant. 1 red, 1 black, and 3 for a 4/2 Ogre Rogue. When it dies, it deals 2 damage to any target, and disguise cost is 2 Rakdos mana and 2. So this is another card that slightly breaks the 5 mana rule of disguise creatures, where if it gets flipped up for anything less than 5, it's probably not going to blow you out. This can trade with a 4 toughness creature and shock and kill some other creature. All at instant speed for just 4 mana, which is kind of gnarly. It can also just swing in, and if it's unblocked, you can flip it to hit for 4, and then still have this ability online where if it dies at any point in the future, you get to shock something. You could even just use it to kill a 6-drop, block their 6/6 or whatever, flip it up for the disguise cost, do 4, die, and do another 2, and kill it. So there's a lot of versatility in how it can be used. And again, it's one of these common disguise creatures that doesn't have to be in Rakdos. It can be in base black or base red with other colors. And you can just play it as a 2/2 ward 2 for 3 and then, you know, flip it up later. So all of these combat tricks are just super fun. Can't wait to use them in Limited. Can't wait for the set to drop. And yeah, definitely snag this guy. Since it's a common, you should be able to pick it up a little bit later in the draft. And it's just a super good grab if it's something that you're grabbing in the last half of a pack. Next up, we've got Soul Search. 1 black and 1 white for a sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You get to choose any non-land card from it and exile it. So that alone, that's good. But if the card's mana value happens to be 1 or less, you can also create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. So it's just like extra value, extra gravy. You do want to consider it extra, because most of the time you're not going to want to hit a 1-drop just so you can get the flyer, right? Most of the time you do want to hit the most relevant threat in their hand. But it's still nice that you have this little bit of upside here where if you do happen to hit something small, you get a little extra value. Maybe you're worried about them casting that cut down next turn, right? And killing your creature that you put out on turn 1. You can Soul Search, remove the cut down, and also get a 1/1 flyer on top of it as some extra value. And that's pretty sick. So as an extra, just a little bit of extra value baked into the card, I think it's great. But don't lose sight of the fact that you don't need to get the 1/1 for this to be good. Just getting rid of the best card in their hand and it being exiled, a lot of times is just going to be good enough. So I think if you're in the colors, you absolutely slam this. Just hitting their best bomb in their hand that they can no longer play once they get enough mana is always going to be backbreaking. Next up, we've got Sumala Sentry, a 1/3 elf archer for 1 white and 1 green, has reach, and whenever a face-down permanent you control is turned face-up, you put a +1/+1 counter on it and a +1/+1 counter on Sumala Sentry. So this guy would have been really good even if it was just either or. Either one gets a counter, either the thing you turn face-up or the Sentry. The fact that both of them get counters makes this guy kind of insane because he comes down as a halfway decent blocker on 2 already as a 1/3 reach, right? Can block 2/2s all day even if they're in the sky. But then as soon as you just flip one creature face up, now it's a 2/4 reach that only costs you 2 mana. You didn't have to spend any extra mana when you turned those things face up more than what you just normally would have had to spend to turn them face up. And you got a 2/4 reacher that costs you 2, and the thing you turn face up has a counter on it. At that point, it's just insane. And then everything after that is just sheer value and sheer gas, making this even bigger, making even more creatures bigger that are turned face up. Like, it's just kind of bananas. I think if you're in green-white, you're just going to slam this. This is like a very, very high pick because I think Disguise is going to be so prevalent. I don't think you have to, like, be into Disguise as an archetype for it to show up way more in your deck than the average archetype would. I think Disguise is just on average going to kind of be everywhere, and then even more everywhere in the archetypes that can take advantage of it more. But even outside of that, just in normal decks and limited, I think Disguise is going to be a lot more prevalent than most set mechanics happen to be in limited. So I just think this guy's going to be good incidentally in a lot of ways. So I think you just slam him if you're in the colors. Just pick him. Pick him high. Pick him first pick, or at least second pick. Next up, we've got Teysa, Opulent Oligarch. 1 black, 1 white, and 1 for a legendary human advisor. It's a 2/3 with Death Touch. At the beginning of your end step, you investigate for each opponent who lost life this turn. And whenever a clue you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying, but the ability triggers only once each turn. Now, let me take a sip of coffee. Only triggering once a turn is a little bit deceptive, because if you've got multiple clues on the board that you can crack, it's not really a problem to just wait until your opponent's turn and crack one on your opponent's turn, right? So you can crack a clue on your turn and get a 1/1 flyer, and then crack a clue on your opponent's turn and get another 1/1 flyer. So even though this reads it triggers only once each turn, you kind of read it as it triggers twice every turn cycle, right? And in that way, that makes this card a lot better than it otherwise would be. The fact that you get a free clue token at the end of your end step as long as your opponent lost life means you want to jam this in an aggressive deck. If you're swinging in every turn, and it's very hard for your opponent to make the decision to like block and trade and maybe lose their better creature than what they're blocking, or let it through, and then Teysa is just going to trigger and let you draw another card and get another 1/1 flyer, it starts to get kind of wild, right? But even as those 1/1 flyers start to build up, they're getting through for damage because they have evasion, and because they get through for damage, you're triggering the investigate, you're getting another clue token, and the synergies just start to compile. And then not only that, but Teysa has Death Touch herself, so even if you have to swing in with her, like, they can't block without losing their thing. And most of the time you can just hold her back as a blocker, and they can't attack with their best thing, or you get to trade with it. You get the choice of trading with it if that's best for you, or just not, and just keep using these abilities. Keep cranking out clue tokens and 1/1 flyers. I feel like this guy's better than he looks. Or I guess she looks, right? It's really easy to just see it as a 2/3 Death Touch, where all of the abilities have hoops you have to jump through and might not be as good. But when you really start to dissect what those hoops are and how easy it is to trigger them, you only really need to get in for damage once and get that first clue token in order to get your first 1/1 flyer. Before now, you don't really have to worry about it, and your flyers can just do all the work and start generating those clues, and that which generate more tokens. And that kind of starts to take over for you. And then, at that point, you don't have to worry about finding ways to make them lose life anymore, right? So even if you can't get through for damage initially, if you have another way of making a clue token, you can just sack a different clue you made a different way to make your first 1/1 flyer, and then get in with that in order to make them lose a point of life and give you another clue token so that you can start to snowball it that way. So there's a lot of versatility in how you can get this thing to synergize and work out and get you value over the course of the game. And once you do, it's just making you a bunch of 1/1s and drawing you a bunch of cards, and then like sitting there as protection against their biggest threat. Like, all of that's amazing. So slam this in your limited deck for sure. I really, really, really want to find a constructed deck that this will slot into, because I just think it's better than it looks on the surface, and in practice, it's going to be kind of insane and snowball out of control. Next up, we've got Tin Street Gossip, 1 green, 1 red, and 2 for a 4/4 Viashino Advisor with Vigilance. It also has tap to add 1 red and 1 green to your mana pool, but you can only spend that mana to either cast a face down spell or to turn creatures face up. But that's still really good. The fact that this is a 4/4 Vigilance for 4, it's already going to be a great creature for Gruul, right? But then on top of that, you're able to tap this for mana and speed things out. And because of the Vigilance, you're able to swing first. You don't have to not attack. You don't have to slow down your aggression in order to get that mana, which is kind of insane. So you're swinging for 4, and then you tap it for 2, and if it's turn 5, the turn after you played Tin Street Gossip, you could have up to 7 mana to play face down spells, turn things face up. 5 of that mana can be spent on normal spells. Maybe you play a 4-drop, and then you spend 1 mana and the 2 mana from this to play something disguised. Or spend up to 7 mana on turning something face up that's got a huge disguise cost that's just gonna absolutely take over the game now, because you made it happen way sooner in the game than you probably should. I think this guy is nutty. And since it's an uncommon, and there's more uncommons per pack on average with the new play packs, I'm tempted to say there's going to be a good chance that if you try hard enough to push into disguise as an archetype, it probably isn't going to be too difficult to wind up with at least 2 of these guys. If you can get 2 of these guys in your disguise deck and increase the consistency of turn 4 you drop him, that's just insane, man. Like, the stuff that you can do in subsequent turns with all the crazy face down shenanigans you'll be doing, on top of just the sheer aggression he adds to your board, it's just a lot. So I think if you're in Gruul, it's a high pick no matter what. But if you're in disguise as an archetype, it is like a pack 1, pick 1 level card, to be completely honest. If you know you're in Gruul, and if you are, doubling down on disguise as a mechanic, you definitely have to know for sure you're into both of those things in order for this to be such a high pick. So maybe not pack 1, pick 1, maybe more like a pack 2, pack 3, pick 1, right? Next up, we've got Tolsimir, Midnight's Light, a 3/2 legendary elf scout with lifelink for 2 white, 1 green, and 2. So 5-drop, 3/2 lifelink, definitely overcosted, but what else does it do? When Tolsimir enters the battlefield, you create Voja Fenstalker, a legendary 5/5 green and white wolf creature token with trample. Okay, so it's not a 3/2 lifelink for 5. It's a 3/2 lifelink and a 5/5 trample for 5. That's insane. Not only that, but whenever a wolf you control attacks, if 𝑇𝑒𝑒𝑟𝑟 attacked this combat, target creature an opponent controls blocks that wolf this combat if able. That is a really good extra ability. That means if they've only got one blocker, you can safely swing in with both creatures and make sure they have to block the wolf so that 𝑇𝑒𝑒𝑟𝑟 survives and can't be killed in combat, and Voja probably kills the thing that blocked it as well. Even if they have more than one blocker, you can still force the thing you want to block Voja that's going to give you the most value, their 4/4 or whatever, and not be able to kill Voja in combat. You can force them to block Voja still with that, and still be swinging with a 3/2 lifelink as well, even if it does end up trading. So there's just a lot of different ways you can utilize this, and a lot of value. Even though 5 mana is a lot, the fact that you get a total power toughness of 8/7 is just kind of insane, and with 2 keyword abilities and extra gravy on top. So this card's a slam dunk for limited. I wonder if it's too expensive for constructed. With it being a very combat focused card, 5 mana might be too much, but at the same time, it giving you 2 bodies means they can't just blow you out by using removal on it, right? So maybe it is good enough. It'll be interesting to see if this makes the cut in constructed. I'm not sold on it yet, but I'm definitely cognizant of the potential of that to happen. Next up, we've got Tomek, Wielder of Law. This is another one of those pre-release cards that you can only get in a pre-release pack or probably in a collector's pack. 1 black, 1 white, and 1. It's a 2/4 legendary human advisor. It has affinity for planeswalkers, oddly enough, which we'll talk about in a minute. It also has flying and vigilance, and whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you and or planeswalkers you control, that opponent loses 3 life and you draw a card. Okay, so in standard, this is going to be a 2/4 flying vigilance for 3 that if they attack with 2 or more creatures, they lose 3 life and you draw a card. That's still pretty good for standard, right? I'm not 100% sure what deck it wants to be in. Maybe in a human tribal deck with like a roaming throne, so you get double triggers off that trigger. But it's also worth noting that in constructed, you can only really, like in standard, you can only really get value off of 1 planeswalker being in play. So if you do play it in like a Super Friends deck and you're able to get a planeswalker into play on curve and then play this later, it's coming out for only 2 mana. And that's like a nice little bit of extra value. It is just silver lining value. You're not going to build your deck around that in standard. But what's really interesting about this card is in Commander, if you use this as your commander, that affinity for planeswalkers is going to start to really matter a lot more, because as Tomek dies and goes back to your command zone, you get that commander tax of 2. And the affinity for planeswalkers will actually help reduce the cost of that commander tax. So if it dies, goes back to the command zone, and now it's a 5-drop, if you have 3 planeswalkers on the field, you can still play it for 2 mana. And then if it dies again, goes back into exile, and now it's a 7-drop. If you have 5 planeswalkers on the field, it still comes out for 2. So it'll be interesting to see if this is worth brewing a commander deck around specifically that uses this in like an Orzhov Super Friends deck and just uses every Orzhov planeswalker it can get its hands on. That just sounds kind of fun. I want to try it. I don't know if I'll actually brew it, but it's in the back of my mind, and we might. Next up, we've got probably my favorite card of the set, to be honest, Treacherous Greed. 1 black, 1 white, and 1 for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you have to sack a creature that dealt damage this turn, which is a weird hoop to jump through. But you draw 3 cards, and each opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life. So the payoff here is insane. 3 mana, instant speed, draw 3, drain for 3 is bananas. Now, because you're draining for 3, you want to use this in an aggressive deck that's going to help you, where that 3 life loss is going to help you close out the game, right? And in that deck, it's giving you insane card advantage by drawing you 3 cards for 3 mana at instant speed. But you got to figure out the best creatures to sacrifice to turn this on. And I think I have. I think the way this card becomes competitive to a greater degree is playing it with things like Urabrask's Forge. Urabrask's Forge is going to make a token every turn that's bigger and bigger and bigger, slamming in for damage, being aggressive, in a deck where losing that 3 life to Treacherous Greed is going to matter that much more, but it's also creating token creatures every turn that are just going to be sacked at end of turn anyway. So you can easily sack that token to Treacherous Greed, not lose anything after it hit for damage, and kind of get no downside. Turn this into just a 3 mana, instant speed, draw 3, drain for 3, which is just nuts. And then if we double down on that as a deck concept, we can do things like include Case of the Stashed Skeleton, the new black card, because that makes a 2/1 menace that can't block token, and when that token is gone, you get a free demonic tutor, basically. So you can just sack that token to the Treacherous Greed after it gets through for damage, because they're not going to want to block it and give you the demonic tutor. And then that's another free way to, like, draw 3, drain for 3, turn your tutor on, so now next turn you can basically cast demonic tutor. That seems just insane. Really, anything that makes a token creature where that token's just going to die at end of turn anyway is going to be super good with Treacherous Greed. The next best thing to that is going to be just token generation in general. If you can go super wide with tokens and swing with them so that, like, even if they block a couple, there's going to be a bunch that gets through. And because you have so many tokens, like, sacrificing one of them to this Treacherous Greed isn't going to be that big of a deal. I think that's another way of making this really good. Not as good as sacking tokens that are just going to die anyway, or sacking the skeleton from Case of the Stashed Skeleton, but the next best thing. So there is definitely a deck that includes all of those cards and does all of that stuff. And I'm going to brew it for sure. And it's probably going to be one of the first decks we play because I think it's going to be insane. I love this card. And if used just right, it's insanely powerful. It's just nuts. Next up, we've got Trostani, 3 Whispers. This is a 4/4 legendary Dryad for 3 mana, 1 white, 1 green, and 1 white-green hybrid. So it's already a pretty decent body as a 4/4 for 3, right? You can pay 1 green and 1 to give any creature Death Touch until end of turn. You can pay 1 Selesnya hybrid mana to give any creature Vigilance until end of turn. And you can pay 1 white and 2 to give any creature Double Strike until end of turn. What's important to note is it can even use its abilities on itself. And because all of these are instant speed activated abilities, you have the threat of activation, which is what makes it super powerful. Like, if you have 2, 3, 5 mana to hold up during combat, you just swing with the team. And now your opponent's like, what do I do? He can give any creature Death Touch and any creature Double Strike after I choose my blockers. He could even give them both to the same creature if he wanted to. It makes it really hard for your opponent to actually effectively block and figure out how to block. And a lot of times they're going to be letting through a lot more damage than they otherwise should. They're going to have to block in really difficult, painful ways for them to try to mitigate the potential problems from activations here. But then you just don't even have to activate it, right? You get kind of the payoff of if your creatures had Double Strike or Death Touch without actually having to give those abilities to those creatures. The threat of activation is what makes this so powerful. You swing in, your opponent's just like panicking and flipping out and not blocking well because they don't know how to play around these potential abilities, and then you just don't even use them, right? You get in for damage, you maybe kill some of his blockers, and then second main, you still use your mana to play all the same stuff you would have played otherwise. So that makes this really, really good, I think. A lot better than it might appear. And the fact that the only ability that you can't use in that way as like a threat of activation, will he, won't he, is the Vigilance. But that ability is the lowest cost of all 3. It's just 1 mana. Makes that ability more useful. Because you only have to pay 1 mana to do it. So if you know you're going to have an extra mana just chilling around, there's no reason not to give just something Vigilance, right? Your biggest creature or whatever. So all in all, every way you slice it, I think this card is actually really good, specifically because of threat of activation just totally messing with your opponent's mind and them not knowing the right plays to make because of it. So I think this card is bananas. Obviously, you slam it in limited, but I think it could be really good in constructed too. It really depends if there's a deck that can get value out of it. If there's the right deck for this to slot into, I think it's going to see a lot of play. Next up, we've got Undercover Crocodile, a 5/5 elf crocodile detective for 1 blue, 1 green, and 4. Whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you get to investigate, and has Disguise for 2 Simic hybrid mana and 3. This guy isn't so bad. I do think he's not quite as good as some of the other common Disguise creatures we've seen, because he is pretty expensive all around. And all you really get from flipping him is the potential to make a clue token if he hits in for combat damage, which is good. That will help you draw cards when you're out of gas, but at the same time, he's kind of expensive. So, like, if he comes out as a 6-drop 5/5, that eventually when he swings can maybe get you a clue token if it actually gets through, but gets you nothing if they trade with it or if they use removal on it, not great, you know? And even though it's a lot better as a disguise creature, I don't think it's as much better as a lot of the other disguise creatures we've seen. So, you know, put it out as a 2/2 ward 2 for 3, and then later on, flip it in the middle of combat for 5 mana to hit in for 5 and make a clue token. All of that is pretty decent, but you're still flipping it into a 5/5 for 5, which is kind of the rate you want to be just playing to cast a thing, considering you already paid 3 to play it as a disguise creature. So, like I said, I don't think it's as good as the other disguise creatures. That being said, it's still a passable, solid card choice if you're looking to fill out your deck and you need more creatures, or if you're really heavy into the disguise theme and you're going to get extra value off of disguise things. Yeah, you can absolutely play this guy, and he'll fit into the deck. I don't think he's a very high pick, though. Next up, we've got Urgent Necropsy. 1 green, 1 black, and 2 for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you collect evidence X, where X is the total mana value of the permanents this spell targets. And then you destroy up to 1 target artifact, creature, enchantment, and planeswalker. This card is nuts. It's like a Casualties of War on crack, right? You get to hit the most powerful thing in play of each type, which is nuts. And you just need enough stuff in the graveyard to collect evidence with. But it's worth noting, again, and I've said this a few times in the video, that like it's easy to mistake collect evidence, whatever number, for needing that many cards. But you don't need that many cards, right? If you want to kill their Sheoldred and their clue token and their, I don't know, 2-drop enchantment and, I don't know, a 3 mana planeswalker like an Ob Nixilis, that's a total of 9 mana. The clue token has 0 mana cost. So you only need to exile a total of 9 mana cost of stuff from your graveyard. Like, it should be pretty easy to do that, right? Especially if your opponent's been killing your stuff. If they haven't been killing your stuff all along, then you're probably winning anyway, and you don't need to worry about casting this spell. If they have been killing your stuff, you just use it to collect evidence and totally 2, 3, or 4 for 1. Not only that, but like, you could just be playing this in a deck with a lot of instants and sorceries as even more removal, so that you're constantly putting stuff into your graveyard to use for the collect evidence X, and setting yourself up and not relying on your opponent. So I think there's a lot of ways for this to work. I think the idea of collecting evidence being a huge hoop to jump through and not knowing if you'll have enough cards holds this back a little bit. And I think as far as mind share with people thinking that this is as good as it is, I think it does hold that back. So I think this card is a little bit better than everyone's giving it credit for. But at the end of the day, it's also not as good as you might think it could be once you start to think in that way, because it is still limited to 1 of each type. If they've only got a really good creature in play, right, and they don't have a planeswalker, and they don't have an enchantment, and they don't have an artifact, like, you're paying 4 mana and having to exile stuff from your yard that you can't use for other collect evidence cards to like just kill one creature, and that feels really bad. But I guess as a plan B, as a worst case scenario, it can be a little overcosted removal. For one thing, I guess that's fine if it's a plan B, right? So I don't know. I go back and forth on this card. The ceiling is super high, and the floor is not incredibly low, but it is lower than I'd like it to be. So I don't know. Jury's out, but I'm tempted to think this is at least a little better than people give it credit for, even if it isn't quite good enough to see a ton of play. Next up, we have Vannifar, Evolved Enigma. This is another one I'm super excited about. 3/4 Legendary Elf Ooze Wizard for 1 blue, 1 green, and 2. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you get to choose one. Either cloak a card from your hand, or put a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature you control. Now, there's a few different ways this can be used. The obvious way is you're cloaking a card from your hand every turn. So it's coming into play as a 2/2 face down creature with Ward 2. And then once you have a bunch of cloak cards on the field, you start using that other ability to put +1/+1 counters on all of them, since they all technically count as colorless creatures. And then after they've got a bunch of counters on them, you can start turning them face up for their mana cost if they're creatures on the bottom side, and they keep all the counters. So that's a lot of turns. That takes a lot of build up to play this card like the way it's intended, the fair way. But it does give you a lot of value if you do that. And then even if they kill Vannifar, all the cloaked cards and the counters are still sticking around. So you do have leftover value, which is really, really nice. Another way you could use this is like in an artifact creature deck. If all of your creatures in your deck are like colorless artifact creatures anyway, and maybe even a couple disguise creatures, then they can all get +1/+1 counters every turn from this, and you can just use it in that way, which I don't think is as cool, but it still is a way this could be used that's kind of interesting. And then the best way to use it, in my opinion, is with flicker effects, because the fact that you get to choose what card gets cloaked, I think this is the one card in this set that gives you the most agency on choosing what card comes into play cloaked, because it can be any card from your hand. And that's what makes this so powerful. You could choose a Portal to Phyrexia in your hand. You could choose a One with the Multiverse in your hand, have it come into play as a cloaked creature, and then if you have anything that flickers at all, you just flicker that card and have it come back into play as the thing, right? Which is insane. The idea that as soon as turn 5, even without ramp, you could just get any permanent onto the battlefield by cheating it into play with flicker effects seems kind of wild. And not only that, but until you do the thing, it's a 2/2 creature with Ward 2. So the Ward 2 makes it harder for them to remove. So not only can you crazy combo out like a turn 4 or 5 like Portal to Phyrexia, but until you do the combo for that one turn cycle that it's out as a creature, it's protected from the Ward 2. So your opponent has this small window of like, hurry up and kill the thing before they can flip it, but they need an extra 2 mana in order to do that, and they might not have that. So that's kind of cool. I mean, I just think that is an insanely awesome and unique way to use a card like this, and I absolutely want to brew with it. I can't wait. Next up, we got Voja, Jaws of the Conclave. This is the last of the 3 pre-release only cards, so you can get this in a pre-release pack or probably a collector's booster. This is a 5/5 legendary wolf with Vigilance, Trample, and Ward 3 for 1 white, 1 green, 1 red, and 2. That's a lot. Whenever Voja, Jaws of the Conclave attacks, you put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is the number of elves you control. So if you already had Tolsimir out, you're at least putting a +1/+1 counter on everything. But that's not all. You also draw a card for each wolf you control when it attacks, and that counts itself. So even if Voja is the only creature on the field, it swings in with Vigilance and Trample as a 5/5 and draws you a card, right? Which is bananas. If you played Tolsimir already, like we were talking about, not only do you get the X +1/+1, like the 1 +1/+1 counter from Tolsimir itself being an elf, on everything, but then you're also drawing 2 cards, one from the Voja that you made the token with the Tolsimir, and one from this Voja, Jaws of the Conclave. So it just seems nuts, you know, and you don't even need all of your wolves to be attacking for you to draw that many cards. They just need to exist. The only one that needs to attack is this Voja. And I just think it's awesome. And I also love the way that they're using Ward 3 here, because I've argued for a long time now that they need to find ways of making 5-drops more usable without having to have them have ETB triggers, right? And the best way to do that, I think, is Ward 2 or Ward 3. Because what it effectively does is you play this on 5, and normally a 5-drop on 5 that doesn't do anything, I mean, this kind of can do something theoretically, but normally a 5-drop on 5 that doesn't do anything the turn it comes into play, the reason it's not usable is because they can just kill it with removal that costs a lot less than 5 mana. So if they do that, all you did was get 1-for-1'd, but lose a whole bunch of tempo, because they spent half the mana you did and can still spend the rest of their mana doing something else that turn. And that's why 5-drops that don't do something the turn they come into play are so unusable and nobody runs them, even if they're awesome cards, because they put you at such a tempo disadvantage when the obvious removal just hits them as soon as they're cast. But with Ward 2 or Ward 3 on a 5-drop, what you see here, in this case with Ward 3 with Voja, is they can't kill this thing without spending an extra 3 mana, which means if they're using a 2-mana removal spell, which is the cheapest thing that's going to be able to kill this, they have to pay a total of 5, which is the same amount of mana you paid to cast Voja in the first place, which means they don't get the tempo advantage. It's an even 1-for-1, both in cards used up and in mana spent. But if they have to cast a 3-mana removal spell, they actually get at a tempo disadvantage, right? They have to spend 6 mana to do that, to kill your 5-drop, which is just even better. So I think this card is a perfect example of how do we make 5-drops worth it in Constructed without having to rely on what's getting tired at this point, the whole like, oh, it gets you value the turn it comes into play. Like it's just every deck these days is just, well, does it give you value the turn it comes into play? Okay, then it's unplayable. And it just gets so boring working around that deck building constraint. So finding another way to make 5-drops like this usable by using something like Ward 3 is just awesome. I love it. I want more of this. I love this card. I want to brew around it. It's awesome. Play the damn thing. We're moving on. War Leader's Call. Another card I'm in love with. Some people don't think it does enough. I think they're crazy. This is an enchantment for 1 white, 1 red, and 1. It's a Glorious Anthem meets a... What is that card called? Impact Tremors? Yes, Impact Tremors. It's a Glorious Anthem meets Impact Tremors for the same price of a Glorious Anthem. It's a 3-mana enchantment, gives all your creatures +1/+1, but then also, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you deal 1 damage to each opponent. So this is obviously going to be pretty good in some kind of a Boros aggro deck, right? Where you're going wide with a bunch of creatures quick, so that you can take advantage of those buffs, but also do extra damage on whatever creatures you happen to be playing later on in the game after the War Leader's Call hits the field. But where I think this is even more useful is in a go wide token deck. If you're playing a ton of cards that can make tokens turn after turn, you just start to exponentially get value off of this cards. Like, the fact that every token coming into play is going to do a damage to the opponent is kind of gnarly. The fact that this triggers off of any creature entering the battlefield under your control and not just a creature spell is key. All of those token creatures you make with Wedding Announcement or 3 Blind Mice or Adeline or Anim Pakal or whatever, they're all triggering this thing, and it's just bananas. But not only that, all of those creatures going wide with a bunch of small creatures are even more useful because they're all getting buffed with this Glorious Anthem effect as well. So not only are you becoming insanely lethal with your ability to ping them for damage with the Impact Tremors part of this card, but your board is like doubled in size because of the Anthem as well. So I think having both of these abilities on one card for the same cost as what normally would be just one of these abilities is just insanely good. And this card's a perfect example of a card that is better than the sum of its parts. Like, Impact Tremors on its own, a little bit too build-aroundy, right? An Anthem on its own, these days with power creep, just not enough value. But having them both tacked onto the same card is just bananas. It's just bananas. We're absolutely going to build that token deck, and I think it's just going to be insane. So I'm excited. I'm excited to play this card. Next up, we have Wisp Drinker Vampire. This is a 2/4 Vampire Rogue with flying for 1 black, 1 white, and 2. It's an uncommon. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this is another example of a card that's going to be really good with tokens, right? Because it triggers off any creature with power 2 or less entering the battlefield. It doesn't care if it's a creature's spell that was cast. So draining for 1 every single time, and that not being limited to once a turn, like a lot of times you see abilities like this being limited to, is really awesome. Especially when you take into account the fact that it's on a 2/4 flying body that's decently on rate, that can at least sit there and help, you know, help block 3/3 flyers or whatever, gum up the board a bit while it's draining. Seems like it could be pretty good. Not quite enough on its own, but pretty close. But then you take into account the fact that it has this other ability. For 7 mana, you can activate this ability. Creatures you control with power 2 or less gain Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn. So, like I said, if you're in this whole, like, token tribal, like, go wide with power 2 or less creatures kind of archetype, like, if you can get to 7 mana, it's just insane. Like, this automatically becomes an insane win condition. You can just swing with everything, and it doesn't even matter. Like, if they block them, they lose their blockers. If they don't block them, you're getting through for damage and helping close the game. And if they crack back, you don't even have to worry about it because all your guys got lifelink. So, like, it doesn't matter, right? You're gaining all the life back that they're just going to do damage to you in the crackback anyway. So, once you hit that 7 mana threshold, you can just, breaks are off, like, let's just go, and you can just jam everything down your opponent's throat, and it will feel so good. Not only that, but this fits really well into the power 2 or less archetype as a whole. Not only because both of its abilities do, but also because it is a 2-power creature itself, which is really nice to have this decent flying body, especially for blocking, that does synergize with those 2-power or less tribal themes. I actually think this is probably one of the better cards to use in that archetype. And I think if you're going that archetype, you definitely want to try to play this card. But like I said, once you hit that 7 mana, it's just game over. And you don't really, that doesn't need to be plan A. That's what's great about it, right? It can just be an extra thing where if the game's still going on when you happen to get to 7 mana, well, now you can just win. Like, now you just win as an extra thing, right? So I just think this card is really good. Maybe it's because I'm partial to flying creatures in limited, but I'm going to pick this pretty high in limited. Next up, we have World Souls Rage. This card is also bananas. This is making me really, really want to make a landfall deck with Tatyova. This is 1 green, 1 red, and X. For a sorcery, World Souls Rage deals X damage to any target, and you put up to X land cards from your hand and or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. This is kind of gnarly. So, first of all, it's really easy to enable this card if you're using New Capenna Sack lands, because they're all in your graveyard anyway, just waiting to be grabbed with this thing. So you don't have to jump through the hoops of, like, self-milling or any of that, right? But it's super cool that it's removal and ramp. Like, being able to kill the key creature you need to kill, and then also put 3-4 lands onto the battlefield. And if those are all New Capenna lands, like, they're all counting as double landfall triggers. So it's really like you get 8 landfall triggers off of this if you do that. Like, that seems kind of absurd with something like a Tatyova in play, or really any landfall payoff. But what's also cool about this is the first copy sets up the second copy. So the first copy, you're removing a key threat and ramping out some lands. And then when you draw into your second copy, now you have way more lands out. So you could just play it for X being way more, which means potentially this doesn't have to just target a creature. This could target their head. You could just ramp into this to ramp into this to then cast the final one for like a ton of damage straight to their head. So the fact that the earlier World Souls Rage help you ramp to enable the later World Souls Rage to just be a finisher is a really cool sort of silver lining value in this card. And I think it's going to be easily overlooked. It can hit any target. So this card just does everything you want to do in a ramp deck, as long as you're in the ramp deck. Like being able to ramp you, being able to get tons of landfall triggers, being able to remove threats along the way, being able to be a win condition under the right scenario. I absolutely want to jam this card. I can't wait for it. It's just going to be so fun. Also, if you've seen me itching my nose a lot, it's because I just got done being sick. And the tail end of me being sick is still kind of lingering. And I keep getting the urge to like sneeze. And it's not good. And I'm trying to like, not do that. But it is what it is, I guess. So if that's been awkward, this whole thing, the whole video, that's why, and I apologize. We're going to move on to the last card here, which is Yarus, Roar of the Old Gods. This is a 4/4 legendary centaur druid for 1 green, 1 red, and 2. So it's pretty on rate, 4/4 for 4. Other creatures you control have haste, which is pretty insane. It would be a little bit better if it was on a creature that was less costly. Because the earlier you give all your stuff haste, the better. But it's still great, right? It's still great that like after turn 4 or maybe 3 with ramp, every creature you play is just going to have haste. Like that's kind of gnarly. Whenever one or more face down creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card. So this really wants to be in disguise decks, right? And then whenever a face down creature you control dies, you return it to the battlefield face down under its owner's control if it's a permanent card, and then you turn it face up. That's just insane. That last ability in conjunction with the other abilities is what really makes this card nuts. And you can use this the turn that you play it. So say turn 3 you just play a disguised creature, right? And then turn 4 you slam Yarus. Well, now you get to attack, right? They have to let it through. If they block it, it just comes back and turns face up for free, and you get the free front side of the card, which is probably more costly than what you could have even cast on turn 4 anyway, right? But if they don't block it and they let it through, you get to draw a card. So no matter what they do, you get value off this card the turn you play it. But then if it survives, it gets even crazier. Everything gaining haste means you could just disguise a creature and immediately swing with it. Just seems bananas. Not only that, you could theoretically like sacrifice your disguised creatures to sacrifice abilities, and it triggers the when they die, return it to the battlefield and then turn it face up. Like there just seems to be so much potential here at the ceiling of this card. It is going to be a bummer when you play it and then they just kill it. But that can be said for any 4-drop, right? I think what's important to note is just the fact that you play it when you've already got a disguised creature out, and you're going to make sure you get value off this card before they remove it no matter what. And that's an important part to making this card worth it. But at the end of the day, all of this on top of a pretty reasonable 4/4 body for 4 anyway makes this card a slam dunk. You're going to want to jam it in Disguise Tribal for sure, but even in any just Gruul deck in Limited that happens to have some disguised creatures just mixed in, which all of them are going to have at least a couple, right? I would assume. This is just going to be a great card. Honestly, even if you didn't have the disguised creatures, just a 4/4 for 4 that gives everything haste, and maybe they're so worried about you having disguised creatures down the line that they like prioritize killing it anyway, and they don't kill your better thing. Like, there's just a lot of value to be had with this guy. And this is the guy that actually makes me wonder if disguise as an archetype could be a thing in Constructed. If it is, this guy will definitely be a big part of it, because I think this is probably the biggest payoff to that sort of archetype if it comes to standard. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens. I don't know for sure, but this set is looking wild. That is the end of my multicolor review for the set review for Murders at Karlov Manor, which ends my set review as a whole. I do still have a video coming that is I'm not sure if it's going to be 7 or 10, but the first decks that I want to brew for Constructed, for Standard, as soon as the set launches. And when that video comes out, you're going to be able to vote on my Patreon for what order you want to see me brew those decks in. If you're even at just the $1 tier. So if you're interested in that, you want to see very specific decks that I've mentioned during this video, you want to make sure they happen sooner rather than later. Don't have a whole ton of patrons yet, just a handful, so every single person that signs up is going to have a huge say and a big impact on like what order I do those decks in. So if you're interested in that, just head on over to patreon.com/quarantinedcapricorn, sign up at the $1 tier, and tell me which one I need to do first when that video goes live. I've also got a video that's going to be going up that's my top 10 cards for Constructed and my top 5 for Limited. That one's going to be pretty fun. And then launch day is coming up right around the corner. It's upon us on Tuesday, so really excited for that. Gonna hit the ground running with a 12-hour launch stream, and maybe even a 12-hour stream the next day to make up for the fact that we didn't get early access this time. So there's going to be an awful lot of streaming happening. There's going to be an awful lot of deck techs going up on the channel, and I am super excited about it. So look forward to all of that. Thank you for sticking it out. If you made it to the end of the video, this is like a 3-hour long video. It's crazy. If you stuck with me all the way to the end and you watched the whole thing, comment down below and just say, I'm a real one, because I want to know who's a real one and who actually stuck it out to the end, because this was a lot. It was a lot to make and put together, and it's going to be a lot to edit. So those of you who stuck by me and made it worth it for me to put out this content, it really does mean a lot to me. So let me know in the comments, and I'll see you at the launch of Murders at Karlov Manor. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck techs, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.